Chapter 2155. Zhang Yan didn't know what these changes would bring, but it wasn't a bad thing for him. Zhizhuang Daoren must have felt the changes as well, and he must be more concerned about it than him. After all, Zhizhuang almost re-established the rules after severing the Tao. But at the same time, he must try his best to protect these rules. He said, "I hope fellow Taoist won't let the avatar escape again." Zhizhuang Daoren said, "I made a mistake this time. This is the result of someone's scheme. I didn't want to see it." How could Zhang Yan not understand? How could a treasure spirit know the way to touch the creation of Pauline? So someone must have told him about it. And the person behind this couldn't have just wanted to disturb Zhizhuang's arrangements. He must have wanted something. But even so, Zhizhuang couldn't get rid of the responsibility. Who asked him to promise that there would be no more threats from that existence? He said, "Since you said that you were the one who guarded the heavenly order, then you should be on guard against all kinds of tricks. If there are always changes, how can we trust you?" Zhizhuang Daoren bowed and said, "You are right, fellow Taoist. This kind of thing will never happen again." Zhang Yan said, "I hope so." After he finished speaking, his thoughts shifted, and his body returned to Bushutian, landing in the Qinghuan Palace. He thought back to the situation just now and felt that there was something worth noting. Just when he and Zhizhuang were fighting against the avatar, Zhizhuang didn't ask him to take out the lotus petal in his hand. This was worth pondering. He kept thinking, if he didn't take out the petal in time just now, what would Zhizhuang do? Would he use some other method, or would he use the Pauline in his hand to activate the power of the petal? If it was the latter, it proved that even without Pauline, she could still control the lotus petal. If he just sat still right now, he might be able to find out the truth. However, in the end, he still chose to directly activate the petal's power because he felt that doing so would be more beneficial to him. Now that he thought about it, he felt that it was worth it. Ever since he entered the second-degree realm, although his cultivation had been moving forward, he was still stuck in the second-degree realm. On one hand, it was because his cultivation was still accumulating. On the other hand, it was because he had never seen a cultivator of the third stage, so he was unable to glimpse the power of the upper stage. Since creation Pauline could be held by the great virtue, it was an object of the same level. Thus, watching the collision of these two objects was equivalent to watching a battle of this level. It was already extremely beneficial, not to mention personally participating in it. If one were to simply circulate one's energy within the divine will, although it would be able to block off some hidden attacks, one would not be able to experience all of this. Actually, this was just an unexpected gain. The real gain this time was the collision of the two creation Pauline, which shook the rules of heavenly justice and allowed him to see many mysterious principles. Many of these wonderful theories were messy and disorderly, and there were even some scenes of the essence of creation breaking apart. However, he could sense that there was an extremely important clue hidden in these messy and disorderly images. Thus, he sorted it out a little. Although he did not manage to sort out everything, he still gained something. He found out that there was an object that was nameless and formless, and could not be touched. However, since he could feel it, it meant that he could recognize it. If he could find it and understand it completely, there was no doubt that he would gain great benefits. Right now, he could not touch it completely. It was very likely that the object had already surpassed his own level, but for some reason, he could still see it. The reason could not be put aside for now, he just needed to find a way to let himself try to identify it. He pondered for a while and already had an idea. After a while, the figure of a Taoist slowly condensed in front of him. This was the mental image. It could be said to be himself, or it could also be said to be the manifestation of his own cultivation and magic power. Because since that object could be seen by him, it must have some kind of connection with him. Since he could not take it directly, there was no harm in taking a detour. Using another him or using his magic power to directly receive this object, then there would be no need for him to sense or even understand it. He could try to visualize himself. This was similar to unraveling the unseen and the unknown. You could see this thing on the way, but you couldn't see it completely. When you could see it clearly, you would naturally understand everything here. However, in his heart, he always felt that these things seemed to be deliberately transmitted by someone. On the surface, it looked like it was left for him. Because he had already clearly sensed it long ago, this direction was too clear. But it was also possible that it was left for the spirit refinement cultivator who was already on the way to the third stage. Right now, in the silence, perhaps only he, a second stage cultivator who had not been obstructed by creation Pauline, would have such a situation. But no matter what, this was a good thing. Originally, Dodo was far away, and he did not know where to find the way forward. But now, after this unforeseen event, he had undoubtedly opened a gap, allowing him to see the door. After Taoist Ji Zhuang returned, he sensed for a while and saw that everyone in the mirror lake was safe and unmoving. His gaze immediately turned hostile. He could also guess that the incident today must have something to do with the people of the mirror lake. And the most likely culprit was ancestor Yao Han. But after thinking about it for a long time, for some reason, he did not take any further action. He did not even give any explanation for this matter. On the other side of the mirror lake, Yao Han, Yu Qiu, and Yu Lu were sitting in a circle. Ancestor Yao Han's expression was normal, but Yu Qiu and Yu Lu's expressions were somewhat solemn. They were prepared to be attacked, but after waiting for a long time, there was no movement. Jizhuang Daoren did not seem to want to numb them. It seemed that he really did not intend to pursue this matter. Taoist Yu Qiu said, "Could it be that Ji Zhuang does not suspect fellow Taoist?" Ancestor Yao Han said, "He is certain that I did it. Just now, there is no movement." Taoist Yu Qiu said, "Oh, so what?" Ancestor Yao Han said, "I said long ago that the two of you should not think too highly of Ji Zhuang. So what if he obtained fortune Pauline? After suppressing the divine clone, he blocked the Tao art. This has already restrained most of his strength, and he no longer has any strength left to deal with us." He paused for a moment, then said, "If he wants to punish us now, there are only two choices, suppressing us or driving us out. But he is powerless to do the former, and he does not dare to do the latter. First, I know a lot of things, and he is afraid that I will cause trouble for him after I leave. Second, if we are careless and are devoured by that existence, won't we be helping the enemy? So, it is better to pretend that nothing has happened and let us stay here. If anything happens, he can stop it in time." Taoist Jade Leek said, "That's the principle, but according to what fellow Taoists said, we've undoubtedly been targeted by Ji Zhuang. So long as he's able to free himself, I presume the first thing he'll do is deal with us." Ancestor Yao Han said, "Fellow Taoist, don't worry. Even if the situation has been reversed, there are some things that cannot be fixed. Otherwise, I wouldn't have made all these arrangements." Taoist Yu Qiu said, "Fellow Taoist, you mean?" Patriarch Yao Han said, "This time, the heavenly order has shaken, and my magic power has increased by a lot. Even if Ji Zhuang really wants to attack us, there's nothing to fear. Unless he diverts all of the power of the Lotus of Good Fortune to us, but doing so would mean abandoning all of his previous arrangements. He won't do that." Taoist Yu Qiu said, "Then may I ask, what is the next step?" Ancestor Yao Han smiled mysteriously and said, "The next step is to impart the Tao." Taoist Yu Qiu and Taoist Yu Qiu were confused. "Impart the Tao?" Ancestor Yao Han said, "Yes, impart the Tao. Do you think that Ji Zhuang cut off the Tao just to stop that person from destroying the world?" He pointed outside and said, "Fellow Taoists, if you take a look, you will see that most of the living beings attached to the mirror lake believe in the same Tao. If there is no one behind it, how could this happen?" Taoist Yu Qiu took a closer look and found that it was indeed the case. He frowned and said, "Then why did Ji Zhuang do this?" He had never cared about the current world above the mirror lake because these things did not matter to them at all and did not affect them in the slightest. But now that he realized that Ji Zhuang was focusing on this, he naturally could not understand. Ancestor Yao Han said, "The time is not right, so let's not talk about the reason first. If I want to regain my power, this step is necessary." Taoist Yu Qiu said worriedly, "It seems that Ji Zhuang is taking this matter very seriously. Isn't fellow Taoist openly opposing him by doing this?" Ancestor Yao Han laughed and said, "Fellow Taoists, since you know that he will fall out with us sooner or later, there is no need to retreat. This is a good opportunity to fight for more. Taoist Yu Qiu and Taoist Yu Qiu still felt that it was strange. So what if he imparted the Tao here? The living beings in the mirror lake could be destroyed with a single thought. It seemed like a useless move. However, they could feel that after what happened just now, Ancestor Yao Han was different from before. If it was said that they were able to speak to him as equals before, then right now he was faintly looking down on them. Moreover, they felt a sense of dread. That was why even though they had some objections in their hearts, they didn't speak out against it. At this moment, all of them cupped their fists and said, "As Fellow has said." Patriarch Tai Hung sat cross-legged within the nameless world. Quite a few statues had shattered during the past few hundred years, and only 7 remained standing there. If all of them shattered, then it would be time for him to leave this place. In the depths of his heart, he naturally hoped that his fellow Taoists would be able to return. Since they were able to be drawn over by the master of the chaotic heaven clan, all of them possessed superior disposition and natural endowments. At that time, they were filled with hope of ascending to another dimension to seek the Tao, so it would truly be a pity if their souls were to be annihilated just like that. At this moment, he felt one of the statues start to shake. He couldn't help but look over. The owner of this statue happened to be the person whose vitality had yet to disappear. It was just that the barrier hadn't been broken, and his vitality was fading. He originally thought that he wouldn't be able to return to his original body, but he didn't expect that there would be movement again. Not long after, the statue's surface was filled with vitality. It bloomed with green halos and was surrounded by dense clouds. After the statue cracked, it took another 100 breaths before it dissipated just now. However, what appeared in front of him shocked him. There was no one coming out. What stood there was a green spirit tree with a trunk like a peach and leaves like a crown. Chapter 2156. Ancestral Master Tai Heng was slightly surprised to see that this spirit tree was brimming with vitality, but it didn't release any magic power. Moments later, he saw that a fruit had grown on the tree, and he had some speculations about what was going on. At this moment, Hong Yu walked over. Just now, he had also sensed the commotion here. He thought that another fellow Taoist had woken up, but he didn't expect to see a spirit tree instead. He took a few glances at it and said, "This fellow Taoist's lifespan is coming to an end." Even if he escaped, he wouldn't be able to cultivate for long, so he used a special method to avoid the tribulation and recultivate. Old Ancestor Tai Heng nodded and praised, "This technique is indeed mysterious. It can actually sacrifice one's own cultivation technique to gain new life and steal a trace of the secrets of heaven. It can be considered as a superior Taoist technique." Hong Yu said, "Besides the mysterious technique, he must have borrowed a suitable treasure. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to do this. In terms of cultivation technique, he is also an old member of the 9 continents." Old Ancestor Tai Heng nodded and said, "He is also an ancestor of a sect." As the two of them spoke, the fruit shook. Then, a crisp sound rang out, and the stem fell to the ground. It suddenly split open, and a little boy with eyes like stars walked out from it. He wore a Taoist robe, but he didn't have any magic power on him. Tai Heng and Hong Yu looked at each other and withdrew their auras. At the same time, they projected their images into the world. This way, even mortals could see them. As soon as the little boy saw the two of them, he cupped his hands and said, "I's cultivation has dissipated in a day. I've embarrassed myself in front of the two of you." Tai Heng and Hong Yu bowed in return. Old Ancestor Tai Heng said, "Fellow Taoist, it's already good that you escaped today. It won't be difficult for you to cultivate again in the future." Hong Yu nodded. Both of them understood that although this person had abandoned all his cultivation in order to avoid the death calamity, and he would have to cultivate all over again in order to recover his original cultivation, his original memories and experience were still there. Moreover, this body had been reconstructed, and it could be said that his potential was even greater than before. As long as he did not lack external objects, it would not be long before he could cultivate back to his original state. As for the severing of the Taoist technique, it was for those who cultivated later. This person didn't die and was still the same person, just with a different body. Therefore, the extreme Taoist technique wouldn't fall on him. Old ancestor Taiheng said, "How should we address you now?" The child said, "I avoided death and stole the heavens, only then did I regain my vitality. There's no need to mention my original name, just call me Pan Chi." Old ancestor Taiheng didn't have much magic power, so he couldn't go anywhere. He thanked them for their help and went to find a remote place to cultivate in the future. Hong Yu looked at the remaining statues and knew that only a few people would be able to return. He said, "This realm is just a temporary place for me to live. Once all of this is over, it probably won't exist anymore. Where does fellow Taoist plan to go?" Old ancestor Taiheng stroked his beard and said, "Perhaps I'll go to the mountain and sea realm and see how the sects are doing. After that, I'll find a suitable place to set up an immortal's cave." He had also heard that his disciple Yi Jiuyang's reincarnation had continued the Yaoyin clan, and he was very pleased. However, he was now a prime disciple, so he didn't go up to greet him. Fortunately, it was convenient to travel between the heavens and the myriad realms, so it wouldn't be difficult to find a quiet place to cultivate. Hong Yu said, "Forgive me for being blunt, but at your level, it's difficult to go any further." Old ancestor Taiheng sighed. "Even if it's difficult, we still have a chance. Now that the Taoist magic has been severed, it will be even more difficult for future generations to reach our level of cultivation." Hong Yu didn't say anything else. He didn't know if he could reach the upper realm, but the only way to have the qualifications to talk about opportunities in the upper realm was by severing his past and future bodies. He had wasted a lot of time talking, so he cupped his fists and returned to his immortal's cave to meditate. In the nameless world, Gao Qingtu stood on the trunk of a huge tree, looking at the stars in the sky. According to the rising and falling of the sun and moon, another 50 years had passed. However, he knew that no matter how many years had passed, if he had the chance to go back, it wouldn't necessarily be the same. Perhaps not much time had passed just now, or perhaps even more time had passed. If it was the latter, he didn't know how his old friends and relatives in the Haixing nation were doing. Tan carefully walked over from afar and said respectfully, "Teacher, everyone is here." Gao Qingtu said, "Good, good." Then he walked along the trunk into a huge hollow in the tree, where more than 100 people stood, all of whom were disciples who had listened to his Tao. Many years had passed, and all of them had grown up. Some of them had outstanding latent talent, and their cultivation bases were already catching up to his own. However, in all his attempts to discuss the Tao with them, he hadn't been able to find the answers he was looking for. In fact, most of them couldn't even compare to a cultivator from the mountain and sea realm who had just now stepped into the Tao. Later, he came to realize that the people of the mountain and sea realm had never seen the wide expanse of heaven and earth. They didn't know how insignificant they were. Furthermore, they had been living in this tiny world ever since they were born, which limited their ability to think. As for the disciples of the mountain and sea realm, they knew that they were just one of the many heavens. There were countless almighty cultivators who lived above the highest heavens, and therefore, they had a very clear understanding of their own existence. Because of that, he decided to leave the mountain and continue to seek the Tao in the outside realm. Therefore, he made his decision known to the disciples. "Teacher, you're leaving?" The disciples couldn't believe what they were hearing. Over the past 50 years, Gao Qingtu had become their spiritual pillar of support. Originally, they had assumed that they would listen to his Tao just as they had in the past, but now that he was leaving, many of them began to panic and began to try to persuade him to stay. Gao Qingtu stood his ground. "The spirit trees I've left behind are more than enough for the people of the mountain and sea realm to flourish," he said. The tribe's population had continued to expand. Originally, the mountain had not been able to hold them all, so they had used the spirit trees to fill in the land. At first, it had been very difficult. Gao Qingtu had to personally dive down to the bottom of the water and use his magical power to stimulate the growth of the spirit trees. Then he would lay down the soil and stone on top of the trees. Eventually, the disciples were able to use their magical power. Just now, things were much easier. The land that could be inhabited was now 3 times larger than before, and the tribe was no longer in danger of survival. Tan was as calm as ever. He stepped forward and saluted. "Teacher, where are you planning to go?" Gao Qingtu said, I want to see if I can find the gate of the two realms and go to the outer realm. At the same time, I can also look for other tribes that might exist. Are any of you willing to go with me? Ever since he came here, he had been thinking that there must be a reason why the gate of the two realms led to this place. Logically speaking, there should be a gate of the two realms here. If he could find it, he might even be able to travel to other places. Atan said loudly, I'm willing to go with you, teacher. As soon as he said this, some of the disciples also voiced their agreement. Seeing that Gao Qingtu had made up his mind, no matter how reluctant they were, they could only let him go. After some discussion, about 10 people decided to go with him. This did not mean that there were no more people willing to go with him, but that the tribe's hunting and gathering mostly depended on these disciples who had learned the Tao, so it was impossible for too many of them to go at once. 3 days later, Gao Qingtu and the 10 disciples used a large log as a raft and floated towards the depths of the vast ocean under the eyes of the people of the tribe. Although they were riding on a wooden raft, it was actually a large log that had grown for a full 50 years. There were naturally tree holes on the raft for them to rest on, and there were also epiphytic straw mushrooms for replenishment when necessary. However, Gao Qingtu and the disciples who followed this time did not need to eat ordinary food, because with their realm, they were equivalent to cultivators of the core formation, so they only needed to breathe and regulate their breath. This was also the most difficult thing for Gao Qingtu to understand. Where did his strength come from? It was just that after so many years, he still could not understand this level. He even guided these disciples to think in this direction, but most of them thought that Gao Qingtu was the god in the prophecy. Since he was a god, wasn't it natural that he had this ability? Although Gao Qingtu could not find the same path, he thought that this was also good. Without this obstacle, these disciples would not have too many obstacles in their cultivation, and they might even be able to continue to advance. As for how far they could go, it was hard to say, but the biggest problem for people in this world was survival. As long as they passed this obstacle, no one would think about these things. He turned his head and looked towards the depths of the boundless ocean, hoping that this time, he would be able to find the answer he wanted. Zhang Yan stood in the main hall of Qinghuan Palace, looking forward with his sleeves behind his back. At this moment, the visualized image that he had conjured using his mana had become somewhat unfamiliar. This was because he could not comprehend what he had received yet. If there were no accidents, this should be the power left behind by an unknown powerhouse. If his cultivation increased again, and the visualized image had no more reason to invest in it, then it would soon return to the appearance that it had just now. He did not want to see this situation, because only by seeing more unknowns could he continue to advance on the path of Tao. As he gradually deepened his cultivation and visualization, he unraveled more and more unknowns, but there was a problem here. The more he did so, the more the great Tao in front of him extended and expanded. He knew that this was because he had not been able to solve the fundamental problem. If this continued, although his mana could continue to increase, his realm could only stagnate in the second stage, and the further he went, the harder it would be to find the true Tao. This was just like the cultivator Du Ju. No matter how brilliant his mana was, no matter how much he improved, he could not break through that barrier. He pondered deeply, perhaps he should change his method of pursuing, and in the spirit refinement realm, the most direct method was to fuse mana with mana. However, as soon as this thought arose, the visualized image that had been standing there all this time turned to look at him, then stretched out a finger and pointed at him. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed slightly, and with just a thought, he brought it along and escaped into the spirit's will. This should be his urgent desire to peek into the upper realm, which caused the visualized image to take the initiative to attack him. This was because cultivators could only see more of the great Tao through battle. Judging from the Weili that had been accepted, it must have come from a higher realm. At this moment, this visualized image could be seen as a projection of part of a great virtue's power. If they fought outside, Bu Su Tian's many realms would probably collapse. Fortunately, the visualized image was a manifestation of his heart, and it was one with him, so he could pull it into the spirit's will, and at this point he could fight it freely. With a thought, he also pointed out a finger, and an endless stream of Weili immediately met it. Chapter 2157. Zhang Yan's Weili surged out and instantly collided with the opposing force. At this moment, his mind could not help but tremble as countless profound truths surged into his consciousness. His eyes flickered. Sure enough, the fastest way to obtain the truths of the Great Tao was to compete with one's supernatural power. There was a certain degree of danger in doing so. After all, there might be the power left behind by the Vedanta. However, if he could not withstand it, it was very likely that he would be invaded by the other party and even lose a part of himself. Nonetheless, he had a certain degree of confidence in this. The power displayed by the Vedanta could not possibly be all of it. At most, it was only a part of it, and it might not even be comparable to Ji Zhuang, Yao Han, and the others. It was also because of this that he dared to do such a thing. Otherwise, he would not have allowed the visualization image to activate. It must be known that if he investigated step by step, it was difficult to say that he would not make mistakes in the future. However, he directly put the battle in the light and comprehended the true Tao through the battle. He did not need to pay attention to what might be lurking underneath. Therefore, although the battle seemed fierce on the surface, in reality, he had avoided some possible dangers. As the confrontation between the two sides gradually intensified, the power that the visualization image poured in also increased. Relying on his qi and strength, Zhang Yan did not fall into a disadvantageous position. Moreover, as the comprehension in his heart continued to surge, the supernatural power in his body rose, and he was always able to keep up with the pace of the other party's improvement. At this moment, he also felt that he was gradually approaching the most fundamental problem. After an unknown period of time, after the two Weili forces collided again, the visualization image suddenly stopped, and he could no longer feel a trace of power from it. Zhang Yan found that no matter how many Weili forces he poured into it, it was useless. It was as if the other side was a void. He could not help but ponder. He understood that what lay ahead might contain something that he wanted to know, but because it involved the power of the Vedanta, he might not be able to find the answer even if he pursued it. If he did not pay attention to it now, he could very well withdraw from the divine will and ask it again in the future. But if he took this step and was unable to comprehend its profundities, then he would be trapped here forever, and it would be impossible for him to go out again. However, the scene in front of him made him feel that he had touched something. If he missed this opportunity, he might not be able to fight against Ji Zhuang and the others who were gradually recovering their strength. After considering all this, he did not hesitate. He took a step forward and his whole body took a step toward the visualized image. In an instant, his whole body sank into it. At the same time, the omnipresent mana ripples that filled the void around him suddenly disappeared. Many deity refinement cultivators in the void immediately noticed this anomaly. As soon as Taoist Shunchang noticed it, he instinctively felt that something was amiss. Usually, if a cultivator wanted to retract their mana, it would be their own business, and no one would interfere. However, Zhang Yan had never done this before, and it could be said that there was no sign of it. Thus, Taoist Shunchang tried to communicate with Zhang Yan, but there was no response. He frowned and asked Taoist Zhanyun with his divine will, "Fellow Taoist, do you know what's going on?" Taoist Zhanyun also did not know. He looked down and said, "It's hard to know, but fellow Taoist Xuanyuan's doppelganger is still in the present world, so it shouldn't be a big deal." Taoist Shunchang nodded. This was Busa heaven, and Zhang Yan was the master, so there shouldn't be any problems. He thought for a moment and said, "Just now, I'm asking a question, but fellow Taoist Xinyuan is not answering me. I think there must be something important that has not been done. However, there can't be any chaos in Busa heaven. Fellow Taoist Xinyuan and I should pay attention to avoid any trouble." Taoist Zhanyuan thought what he said was reasonable. They did not trust Qing Sheng and Quan Dao very much because they were afraid of Zhang Yan's Weili. Just now, they were dormant in Busa heaven. If there was no suppression, it was hard to say what they would do. But it turned out that they were worrying too much. Although Taoist Qing Sheng did have a more far-reaching plan, he did not think that he could do anything with his cultivation, which had just passed the enlightenment stage. Moreover, Zhang Yan had only temporarily disappeared from the Weili. Who knew what would happen when he came down? Now that they were not even sure what was going on, how could he do anything? As for Quan Dao and Quan Dao, they had no intention of overthrowing Zhang Yan. Even if someone jumped out now, they would most likely go forward to suppress him. In the mirror lake, Jizhuang Doran's eyes flickered. He had also noticed something strange. After all, Zhang Yan had been releasing Dharma waves to search for the land of creation, and was fighting against him on a certain level. Now that he had suddenly withdrawn his Dharma waves, something must have happened inside. So, he held the creation Pauline and probed inside Busa heaven. But after circling around, he was surprised to find that there was no trace of Zhang Yan's power left. But because it had disappeared so completely, he did not dare to act rashly. He could have used the lotus petal he had given to Zhang Yan to investigate further. Unfortunately, as long as Zhang Yan was in Busa heaven, he would definitely put the petal into his divine will. So, he could not sense it at all. He could not help but sigh inwardly. He pondered for a moment and suddenly thought of a possibility. He said with a surprised expression, "Could it be?" Then he shook his head and said, "No, it can't be." But if something really happened to Zhang Yan, then this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. If he tried to invade Busa heaven now, could he snatch the position of master of this place? If he succeeded, then he would be the sole ruler of this place, and he would be able to do whatever he wanted. Although this was a temptation, he gave up. If he really succeeded, then there was no need to say anything else. But if he failed, the entire Busa heaven would definitely turn against him, and the rules that he had worked so hard to set would be overturned. He was absolutely unwilling to give up the arrangements that he had put so much effort into to fight for an outcome that he could not see through. Patriarch Yao Han also looked at where Busa heaven was. He had some guesses about this, but he could not be sure. But if it was really as he thought, then this was undoubtedly the best time to invade Busa heaven. But it was useless because if he moved, Jizhuang would also move. There was no doubt that he could not snatch this place from Jizhuang. If Busa heaven was taken by someone else, then he would not be able to make a comeback. So, not only could he not make a move, but he had to keep an eye on Jizhuang and prevent him from doing this. In the nameless world, Gao Qingde had been sailing on the ocean with a group of disciples for more than 5 years, but all they could see was endless waves. There was no place to land. However, he was not too disappointed. Many years ago, the tribe had released many wooden rafts carrying seeds in all directions. If they came across land, they would attach themselves to it and grow. Now that they did not see any of these, it was enough to prove that there was no such place in the range they had seen. But these disciples had been freed from the tribe, and could only discuss magic and cultivate the Tao all day long. Their understanding of the Taoist magic had improved. When Gao Qingde had nothing to do, he would tell them about the situation in the mountain and sea realm, and all the disciples, including Tan, were filled with anticipation. After sailing for another half a year, one of the disciples suddenly cried out in surprise, "Teacher, look over there." Gao Qingde looked in the direction he was pointing and saw a vaguely familiar big tree standing there. That was not all. Under the big tree, there was a greenish-gray shadow floating on the ocean's surface. Could it be? With a turn of his Dharma power, he rose into the air and looked down from above. The shadow turned from a line into a surface, expanding infinitely in his field of vision until it connected with the sky. He couldn't help but open his eyes slightly. This is Earth continent? The disciples behind him also flew up into the sky, looking at the incredible scene in front of them with expressions of shock and excitement. From the time they had been born, they had never seen a real land. Now that they saw a world that was completely different from the ocean, they gaped in shock. After his initial shock, Gao Qingde began to ponder the matter. Originally, he had not believed the words of the tribe when they said that they were the highest existence in the world. That was because the people of the tribe had lived in a small, narrow area, and could not possibly look out over the entire realm. It was only later, when they saw no other people living in other realms, that they began to believe the words. But the appearance of this land seemed to have shattered that theory. Of course, there was another possibility. Whether or not it was true, he would have to see it to know. Now that he had a clear direction, he ordered the disciples to push the boat forward. A few days later, They were just now. Tan first looked at the big tree carefully and said, "Teacher, it is indeed grown from the seed that we sent over earlier." Gao Chengtu nodded. The closer he got to the place, the more he noticed something strange about it. The spiritual vigor here was much higher than any other place he had been to. Even if the big tree managed to reach here without any problems, it would only have grown for about 20 years. But now, it was growing so fast that it could pierce through the clouds and reach the sky. It was even better than the spiritual trees in the tribe. This was obviously due to the nourishment of spiritual vigor. After seeing this, he was refreshed. If there was still the door of 2 realms in this world, it would undoubtedly fall in this realm. He said, "I will go to the land to take a look." He paused and reminded, "The spiritual vigor here is flourishing. It is inevitable that there will be strange beasts and demons. All of you need to be careful." All the disciples agreed. The group of people flew towards the depths of the land. Although they did not see any signs of human habitation along the way, there were many creatures here. Birds and beasts were all in flocks. There was even a scene of tens of thousands of hoofed beasts migrating. The scene was very spectacular. This was something that the disciples had never seen before. They were incomparably excited. If this place could be inhabited by humans, then they could move their original tribes here. Gao Chengtu saw a towering mountain, but there seemed to be something flashing under the light. He stared at it for a moment, then flew in that direction. Soon, he saw that it was not a mountain, but an altar that had been built on flat ground. Within a radius of 10,000 miles, there were collapsed buildings and palaces, as if a great change had happened here. When the disciples saw this scene, they could not help but be shocked. Gao Chengtu came to the highest point of the altar and waved his sleeves to sweep away the broken stones. He saw a bright jade embedded on the platform. There was a vortex of spiritual vigor in it. It was bright and dazzling. Just by looking at it, it seemed to be able to absorb his mana. He thought for a while and reached out to press it. His body could not help but tremble. After a while, a light curtain rose, but it stopped after 3 feet high. Ten then landed and asked curiously, "Teacher, what is this?" Gao Chengtu looked at it and said, "Perhaps the thing that I am looking for is here." Chapter 2158. Within Zhang Yan's divine will, the visualized image was still standing there, unmoving. After an unknown amount of time, the image finally underwent some kind of change, and it rippled like water. Zhang Yan's figure flickered, and he finally walked out of it. As for the visualized image, it seemed to be missing something, turning into an illusory image. After he disintegrated it, it only existed here, and it could no longer be drawn out of the divine will. Perhaps this was normal for ordinary people, but for spirit refinement cultivators, it was not normal. He took one more look, and then retreated from the divine will. No matter how a cultivator moved in the divine will, it was only a moment for the outside world. Therefore, even if something really happened inside and outside of Busu Tian, as long as he was not lost in the great Tao transmitted by the great virtue, he would still be able to come out and clean up the situation. However, for a short moment, he really did disappear. It could be said that at that moment, Busu Tian did not have a master, and if an enemy seized this opportunity, they might really be able to break in. Fortunately, he had left his avatar outside, which could be considered a barrier. Although it could not deal with the incoming enemy, it only needed to hinder them slightly, and it would be enough for him to turn around and face the enemy directly. Even Taoist Ji Zhuang, who had the Lotus of Fate, could not deal with him, the master, in Bushtian. At this moment, he looked inside and outside of Busu Tian, but he did not spread out his Weili. Instead, he first considered the problem of cultivation. All the great Tao he saw this time was actually transmitted by the consciousness of a certain great virtue. Just as he had thought, these things were not meant for a single person. Any deity refinement cultivator who had cultivated to his level actually had the right to come into contact with them. It was just that right now, he was the only one who was the most suitable. Although he didn't have any communication with this virtuous benevolent, he had learned a lot from this virtuous benevolent through the collision of their magic power. After successfully coming out of the visualized image, he already knew where the most fundamental problem was. Once this problem was solved, he also understood how to step into the third stage. Even though he still lacked some necessary conditions, from now on he would not fall into the endless great Tao no matter how many unknowns he unraveled. In fact, his harvest this time was not limited to these. He had even glimpsed a trace of the power of a virtuous lord. It could be said that if a virtuous benefactor truly returned in one piece, he or she could easily send everyone in the void of silence into eternal silence. As long as they had not yet reached that person's level, they could not be considered an equal opponent. Perhaps the returning Vedanta would not necessarily do so, but how could he place his hopes on his magnanimity? No cultivator was willing to endure the fact that their existence and destruction were in the hands of others. However, if he wanted to go up, he was still lacking something crucial. He needed something to entrust it to. After solving the fundamental problem, he also understood why the rumored virtuous lords had a creation Pauline. It was because this item could not only complete the most crucial step, but also did not need to be afraid of being disturbed by other Weili peers. It was no wonder that Ji Zhuang was able to recover a part of his power after obtaining this item. Although he had a lotus petal with him, it was now clear that this petal should belong to Ji Zhuang. Others might be able to use it, but it needed his permission. Even if he tried to strengthen this item, he would not be able to use it for himself in the end. Moreover, once it was taken out of the divine will, as long as Ji Zhuang was willing, he could take it back at any time. Therefore, he did not plan to use this item again. But now, he could use this item's qi as a guide to find similar items. Logically speaking, the Pauline held by each virtuous lord could not be used by anyone other than himself. However, from the consciousness transmitted by the virtuous lord, after the creation essence was broken, the two had separated. Therefore, these Pauline were currently in a state of no owner. Unless, like Ji Zhuang, a part of his power had returned, it could not be used. Therefore, as long as he could find a lost Pauline in time and use it to seek the upper realm, then even if these virtuous lords returned, they would not be able to hinder him. After the disappearance of Zhang Yan's Weili, many spirit refinement cultivators had been paying attention to Bushutian's movements, but they did not see his Weili reappear. Even so, no one dared to act rashly. There were different reasons here. If one said that Bushutian was because of Zhang Yan's deterrence in the past, and there was no one strong enough to cause trouble, then no one dared to act rashly. On the other hand, in Mirror Lake, everyone had too many plans, and they were wary of each other. This happened to maintain a delicate balance. After making his decision, Ji Zhuang Daoren no longer paid attention to this matter. Instead, he took advantage of the disappearance of Zhang Yan's Weili to search for the land of creation. If he was lucky enough to find a place, then he could take it for himself. At the same time, he continued to spread the Tao to many other realms. However, what made him unhappy was that he was originally the sole ruler of Mirror Lake, but now there were other people passing down the Tao. It was not difficult to see that this was the doing of ancestor Yao Han. However, after thinking about it, his reaction was just as ancestor Yao Han expected. He did not question them, nor did he do anything. He acted as if he did not see anything. Of course, he didn't have the time or confidence to deal with Patriarch Yao Han right now. Another reason was that the inheritance of a Tao art couldn't be overturned by supreme power alone. This involved a deeper level of profundity. If that was not the case, he could directly use the Weili to change the consciousness of all living beings, or create countless living beings that believed in his Tao. That would be much simpler. However, although he could not forcefully interfere with the Tao, he could act against the Tao Master. Once the source was destroyed, there would naturally be nothing left to do. Although he could not do anything for now, once he returned from the Weili, he could easily deal with all of this. In the cave where the statues were located, another 100 years had passed since Pan Shi had escaped. Ancestor Tai Heng was still in the cave dwelling, continuing to pass on the methods of escape that he had gathered over the years to the remaining statues that were still bound. At the same time, he advised them that even if they had no hope of cultivating the Tao, it was better than having their souls destroyed. So, it was fine as long as they could escape now. Everything else could be considered later. Among the remaining statues, there was one that had the most vitality. This was one of the 3 statues that he had his eyes on. The first 2 had already escaped, but this one had yet to break free. He had already seen that the reason this statue was able to persist until now was not because his cultivation was higher than others, but because he had a longer lifespan than others. Recently, the life force on the statue finally began to move. First, countless flowers bloomed on the statue, and then they withered and withered. However, every time a flower fell, it would take away a strand of binding force. Then, flowers would bloom where the original spot was. As this process continued, the inside of the cave gradually became filled with a strange fragrance and brilliant colors. After dozens of days, when the vitality reached its peak, the statue turned into countless petals that fluttered in the wind. A tall and heroic woman walked out. She tidied up her makeup a little before cupping her hands towards Patriarch Taiheng and saying, "Thank you, fellow Taoist, for helping me escape with your heart transmission technique." Ancestor Taiheng shook his head. "There is no need to thank me. You were able to escape because of yourself." The female cultivator in front of him also did not accept his kindness, even though she almost couldn't escape in the end. It was clear that she was a person with a strong temper. Dandy Guang walked into the cave dwelling and looked at the female cultivator. He bowed and said, "Are you Enlightened Yuling?" Enlightened Yuling looked over and bowed, "I am. How should I address you, fellow Taoist?" Dandy Guang said, "I am the sword-bearing disciple of the Grand Elder, Dandy Guang." Yuling's cultivation was not as profound as Ancestor Taiheng's. Even though her consciousness still existed, she kept it inside and didn't take the initiative to observe the changes outside. Therefore, she didn't know the identity of Dandy Guang and the others. However, now that she mentioned it, she knew why the Grand Elder was here. She said, "What does fellow Taoist Dandy Guang want?" Ancestor Taiheng interrupted, "Fellow Taoist Dandy Guang, fellow Taoist Yuling and I are both from the 9 continents. Why don't I explain the details to fellow Taoist Yuling?" Dandy Guang didn't care about all of this. It was fine as long as the person who came out wasn't an extreme person. If it was someone like that, he would immediately kill that person to avoid future troubles. So, he said, "That's fine as well. However, if anyone wants to leave this place, you have to inform us first." Ancestor Taiheng bowed and said, "That will be the case." Dandy Guang nodded at him, then flicked his sleeves and left. Ancestor Taiheng turned around and told Yuling everything he knew. Jade Mausoleum shook her head and said, "I never imagined that after I left, the sects of the 9 continents would change in such a way." She sighed. Sect leader Qin and sect leader Yu led the sects to ascension, and then successfully settled down in the mountain and sea realm. Such ambition, courage, and even methods are rare. Ancestor Taiheng nodded and said, "When I first heard about this, I was also quite impressed by them." Yuling then asked, "I heard that fellow Taoist Taiheng received guidance from the founder of the Qinsong sect, the great underworld patriarch. What kind of person is this patriarch?" Because of herself, she was quite interested in the past heroes of the 9 continents and the patriarchs of the various sections. The great underworld patriarch was the most unfathomable of them all. But when she saw Ancestor Taiheng, who she had personally interacted with, she couldn't help but ask. Ancestor Taiheng pondered deeply for a moment before he sighed. "If fellow Taoist wants to ask me, then I'm unable to give you an answer. Because I only remember that founding Ancestor Great Underworld helped me, but I'm unable to recall what he looked like or what he said." Yuling thought for a moment, then nodded and changed the topic. Clearly, she knew how important this matter was, so she didn't ask any more questions. After exchanging a few more words, Yuling bid farewell and said that she wanted to go to the mountain and sea realm. Ancestor Taiheng said kindly, "The spiritual opportunity here is very good, and there are a few other fellow Taoists who can discuss the Tao. Why don't you stay for a few more days?" Yuling said firmly, "Although this place is good, it is where others are, not where I should be. Moreover, the Li Mountain sect is still here. Even if I want to cultivate, I will have to return to the Li Mountain sect." Chapter 2159. Ever since Zhang Yan returned from the Divine Will, he had been thinking about the creation Pauline. He knew that Zhizhuang Daoren did not have this item in his hands previously. Otherwise, there was no need for him to retreat when he faced that existence. This item should have been found later, and it was precisely after suppressing that existence's divine avatar, so it was not difficult to guess that the two should be related. Further inferring, that divine avatar originally had the ability to devour everything. Perhaps Zhizhuang had relied on this person's ability to find this Pauline just now. In that case, this could be considered as a shortcut. However, it was impossible for her to use this method. What Zhizhuang took back should be the Pauline that he originally possessed, so even if it was found by that existence's divine avatar, there was no need to fear that it would be snatched away by him. If he used this method, then after the divine avatar found Pauline, he might be able to defeat it, but it would be impossible for him to take it back from its hands. Moreover, he wouldn't do such a thing at the risk of being robbed of everything he had. Therefore, if he wanted to find this item, the safest way now seemed to be to extract a trace of qi from the lotus petal to search for it. However, this was not a small problem. It was like looking for the land of creation. It was completely dependent on luck, and it was difficult to know when one would encounter it. And Zhizhuang Daoren actually already had the creation Pauline, so he only needed to find a way to strengthen it. Therefore, perhaps in the end, before he found this item, he would have already recovered all his power. Once Vedanta returned, no one could stop him, not to mention that there was still that existence outside. Although it was restrained by them now, it would recover sooner or later. If he wanted to break out of this situation, he had to be ahead of this existence. Whoever could achieve their goal first would be the winner. However, if he followed the normal path, it was almost impossible to win against this existence, so he had to find another way. He noticed that it was precisely because of the collision between the two creation Pauline flowers that many unfathomable and indescribable things were revealed, allowing him to learn many secrets. If he were to do it again, would he be able to learn even more? There was no doubt that the change in the void silence was initiated by someone. There were only a few people who could do such a thing, and the person who could make a fuss about creation Pauline was definitely someone who was related to Dada. Otherwise, it was impossible for him to know about this matter. Thus, he was certain that this matter was related to the Yao Han Patriarch. It was just that after void isolation was broken, only he and Patriarch Yao Han benefited. Zhizhuang Daoren didn't gain anything. The reason why he was able to benefit from it was because that Vedanta had taken the initiative to send his consciousness and the profound truths of the great Tao over, and it was not him who had guided it. Under normal circumstances, Patriarch Yao Han would be the only one who would benefit from this. However, due to an accident, he was also the one who benefited. If that was the case, if he took the initiative to trigger such a change, then the one who would benefit in the end would not be him. After careful consideration, he rejected this idea. However, there was one thing he needed to be careful about. It was not difficult for Zhizhuang to guess that this matter was related to the Yao Han Patriarch, but the latter was fine. The magic power that was dissipating in the void silence was still the same. This meant that Zhizhuang Daoren did not pursue the matter. If it was him, he would not allow someone who could threaten him to stay by his side. If he did not act now, it could only mean that Zhizhuang did not have the confidence to suppress this person, or that the price he would pay would be greater than the loss. This was enough to show that the Yao Han Patriarch had the power to fight against Zhizhuang. However, this did not make the situation worse for him. Instead, the fact that Zhizhuang and the Yao Han Patriarch were restraining each other was more beneficial to him. If he wanted to step into the third realm, he needed an item to entrust himself to. However, he believed that even if he didn't have creation Pauline, he could use something else to replace it. He was the master of Bu Su Tian, so he might as well entrust himself to Bu Su Tian. However, the reason why Pauline was that she was pure and untainted. She was not affected by external forces, and she was not afraid of being disturbed by others when she used her magic. However, there were still many strange forces in Bu Su Tian. Even if the owners of these strange forces were not here, they needed to be completely eliminated before this could be done. At the same time, creation Pauline could not give up on the search because of this. It would not take much effort to do this, and it could also calm the minds of Zhizhuang and the Yao Han Patriarch. Although he had this idea, there were still many difficulties to overcome in order to accomplish it. For example, he needed to know one thing first, and that was how the nearly complete treasured lotus of good fortune was able to borrow magic power. Were there any other mysteries behind this? Only by knowing this could he borrow Bu Su Tian. Otherwise, he would not be able to take this step. The consciousness transmitted by the Vedanta did not mention this. Perhaps cultivators would understand after coming into contact with creation Pauline, but unfortunately, he did not have such an item. However, this did not mean that he was out of ideas. He looked at the place where the spiritual opportunity was flourishing. There was a creation Pauline there. Although he could not take it for himself, it did not prevent him from finding out some key things from it. As long as he reached that place and held the lotus of good fortune in his hand, he didn't need to take it for himself. He only needed to hold it for a moment and he would be able to use the remnant of the jade to deduce the mysteries within. He had to plan carefully here. If he rushed forward just like that, even if Ji Zhuang did not know his purpose, he would not let him do it easily because of the previous lesson. He pondered for a long time and came up with a plan. In the nameless world, Gao Chengtu looked at the jade and said, "This item should be the door between the two worlds. With this, we might be able to pass through to the outside world." He shook his head. "I did not expect to find it so easily. I thought I would have to go through a lot of trouble." He looked at the ruins around him and said in a deep voice, "If I'm not wrong, the flood in your world should be caused by this thing." When the disciples heard this, they were all shocked. Gao Chengtu looked at the pattern of a sun and 3 moons carved on the altar and said, "In this world, there should be a sun and a moon. The extra 2 moons should be used to set up a formation to draw spiritual opportunity and forcefully bind the spiritual opportunity of the whole world here." However, the pattern of the sun and 3 moons, coupled with the imbalance of the spiritual opportunity of the world, caused the flood to overflow and led to the disaster. Tan asked anxiously, "Teacher, if we remove this arrangement, will it cause the flood to recede?" Gao Chengtu did not agree. He said, "Unless we can destroy the 2 moons, but I can't do it with my strength. Even if I can do it, don't do it." Tan did not understand. Why? Gao Chengtu said, "I don't know how many years ago this happened. Heaven and earth have their own balance. If there is a sudden change, even though the flood will recede, it will certainly trigger a disaster that is not inferior to the Great Flood." When the disciples heard this, they immediately lost the mood. They did not want to suffer such a disaster again. Gao Chengtu looked at the crowd and said, "You don't have to be afraid. If your cultivation of Tao reaches a certain level, it will be a piece of cake to wipe out these disasters." He said earnestly, "You may be able to go higher in your cultivation of Tao, but if you do not study the principles, you will not be able to reach a higher level. Why don't you follow me to other worlds and broaden your horizons? Maybe it will be beneficial to you." All the disciples had heard from Gao Chengtu that when cultivators cultivated to a certain realm, they would have to go out and experience the world. Firstly, it was to temper their Tao heart, secondly, it was to broaden their horizons, and thirdly, it was to exchange and verify with those of the same Tao. Not to mention anything else, Gao Chengtu himself was a living example. A few disciples were eager to try and express their willingness to go with him. Gao Chengtu waved his hand and said seriously, "Don't be in a hurry to agree. I don't know where the door of 2 worlds leads to. If we fall into the void I mentioned, if we don't find a place to stay in time, even we will not be able to survive. Moreover, after we go, we may not be able to come back. You need to think carefully." When he said this, the disciples hesitated again. At this time, Tan came out, bowed and said loudly, "I am willing to leave with Master. If I can find the door to the upper realm of Tao and Dharma, I can come back by myself. If I can't find it, then I will be the only one left in the tribe. Why should I not go with such a good opportunity?" Hearing what he said, many disciples felt that it was reasonable. They had already been out for so long, and this last step did not make a difference. Moreover, if they missed this opportunity, they might be trapped in this world forever. So, it was better to give it a try. Gao Chengtu said, "This is an important matter. You need to think about it carefully. Why don't you stay here for a few days and see if there is anything else we can use? It won't be too late to make a decision then." After Yuling was freed, she adjusted her qi circulation for more than a month. As Ziqing's spiritual vigor was abundant in the heavenly world, her lost cultivation base was quickly replenished. She also praised the ease of cultivation here. If there were no obstacles in her cultivation base, she would be able to cultivate to the second stage in no time. However, she had made up her mind. No matter how good this place was, she didn't want to stay any longer. After refining many treasures with the help of the treasures here, she prepared to leave. First, she said goodbye to Tai Heng, Hongyu, Pan Qi, and the others. Then, she went to where Wan Guang and the others were and said that she wanted to leave and return to Li Mountain. Wan Guang said, "We are only here to guard against evil spirits. If you want to leave, we won't stop you." After this cave, there is a door of 2 realms that leads to the mountains and seas. You can use it to go there. After Yuling thanked him, she followed a child to the back of the cave. When she saw the door of 2 realms, she felt complicated. In the past, she had to sever her mortal body to escape to the outer world. Now, she only needed a door of 2 realms. Even a junior disciple could use it to travel to the outer world. She immediately stepped forward and entered the spiritual light. She was only in a daze for a moment, and the scenery in front of her had already changed. She was standing on a similar altar. A Taoist who was guarding the altar bowed and said, "I've been ordered to stand guard here. May I know which venerable one has arrived? And where are you going?" Yuling didn't hide anything and said, "I am the former sect master of Li Mountain, Yuling. I have returned from the outer world and am preparing to return to Li Mountain sect." Chapter 2160. The Taoist guarding the altar was startled and quickly said, "True Jade Tomb, please wait a moment." He immediately went to the altar and used a dial to inform the elder of the main altar of this matter. Then he turned around and handed over a jade talisman. He said respectfully, "True Jade Tomb, use this talisman to go to any place you want. There will be no more obstacles along the way." Jade Tomb took it and put it in her sleeve. Then she turned into a clear light and flew to the west. As soon as she left the altar, she felt the endless spiritual vigor of heaven and earth surging toward her. She nodded. The spiritual vigor here was not inferior to that of the world she came from. In fact, it was even purer. It was fortunate that the Qinsong and Shaoqing sects were able to find this place. The Lishan sect established its headquarters again. It was located on the Ziying continent in the southwest of the western desolate region. Whether it was the location of the sects or the number of living beings, it was the most remote place. This was also because the Lishan sect did not contribute much during the 9 continents tribulation of human tribulations or the mountain and sea realms battle against the great demon and heavenly ghost. However, when Lishan sect first came to the mountain and sea realm, there were no upper realm cultivators. Fortunately, although the Ziying continent looked far away at the edge of the mountain and sea realm, it was actually a good place. When Jade Tomb arrived, she saw flowers and trees all over the continent. It was boundlessly beautiful. Colorful petals danced in the wind. The mountains were white, the water was pink, and the blue sky was red. Yuling was slightly satisfied. This place looked beautiful and charming but did not lose the grandeur of mountains and rivers. This was the place where Li Shan's sect should be stationed. He looked into the distance and saw a lake floating in the sky. Countless palaces and pavilions surrounded the lake, rippling with water. In the shadows of reeds, herons and heavenly cranes flapped their wings and flew into the sky. After the sect leader of Lishan sect, Yun Suan, returned from the mountain and sea sects competition, she went to visit the various sections. Recently, she felt that she had gained enough, so she returned to the sect. Recently, she handed over the affairs of the sect and prepared to go into secluded cultivation for a period of time. However, at this moment, she sensed a shocking aura coming over. However, when she looked at it again, she noticed that it was extremely similar to the aura of her own sect, and the cultivation technique was the same. She couldn't help but have a guess in her heart. She tidied herself up a little and went outside. When she saw a clear light coming over, she was even more certain of her deduction. When the clear light arrived in front of her, The light scattered and a tall woman with a vigorous heroic spirit walked out from within. She immediately curtsied and said, "Is it Grandmaster?" Su Han greets Grandmaster. Yuling saw that when this disciple's grand disciple was facing her, his martial ancestor, he bowed to her as usual, without the slightest bit of uneasiness, and without any fear, she nodded her head. This was the demeanor that a sect leader should have. She said, "No need to be overly courteous, you are a sect leader, you should have the dignity of a sect leader when you are outside." Yun Suan nodded and straightened her body with a calm expression. Yuling was even more satisfied. She had high hopes for her disciples, but in the end, none of them could achieve what they had now. However, she did not deny their achievements because of this. If they had not worked hard to support the sect through all the difficulties, Lishan's sect would have fallen long ago, and they would not be where they were now. Thinking about this, she asked, "Have your master and your uncle masters reincarnated and returned?" Yun Suan answered, "I have been watching over Master Gu's reincarnated body, but I have not seen a suitable opportunity to enter Dao yet. If there is, I will welcome him into the sect." Yuling said, "That is good." Yun Suan said seriously, "I came out in a hurry this time, and my manners are lacking. Since Grandmaster has returned, you should invite people from all sects to come here and welcome you with proper etiquette." Yuling thought about it and said, "There is no need." Yun Suan wanted to say something, but Yuling raised her hand and stopped her. She said, "Even if this can boost the sect's reputation, the foundation of a sect is the cultivation of the cultivators in the sect. I can see that your mana is surging, and your Dao is overflowing. You seem to be improving. Why don't you cultivate quietly? When you come out of seclusion, I will not stop you from doing anything." Yun Suan thought about it and agreed. She said, "Grandmaster, you have a long-term plan. It is I who is short-sighted." She raised her head and asked generously, "How do you plan to arrange matters in the sect, Grandmaster?" Yuling said seriously, "Just now, you are the leader of Lishan's sect. Even though I have returned to the sect, it is a taboo to leave more than one sect. I will not interfere with the sect's matters, but if there is an external force, I will agree with you." Somewhere in the sky, in the midst of a verdant forest, a stream flowed from upstream with flowers and leaves. Suddenly, there was a surge of spiritual qi. As the spiritual qi gathered and dispersed, 6 figures appeared on a muddy beach. Gao Qingta looked up, and then looked around. He did not expect that behind the door of 2 realms, there was such a beautiful place. And the spiritual qi was much denser than it was before. However, there were only 5 disciples left by his side. He did not know where the rest had gone. He guessed that they should also be in this world. Perhaps something had happened during the teleportation and they had been separated. However, these disciples all had Dao techniques, so there was no need to worry too much. The disciples did not speak for a long time. The place they came from was very barren, and it was the first time they had seen such a rich and beautiful world. They were stunned. One disciple could not help but ask, "Master, where is this? Is this the mountain and sea realm?" Gao Qingta said, "It's not the mountain and sea realm. I don't know where exactly it is." He smiled. "In any case, it is worth rejoicing that we did not land in the void. The mountains and forests here are beautiful, and there are many living creatures. It should be a place where people live. Let me take a look." He immediately soared into the sky, and all the disciples followed. After flying for a short distance, they saw signs of human habitation. The place where they came from was a rather prosperous town. There was a river flowing through this place, and there were busy ships coming and going. It could be seen that this was a waterway pass, a place where merchants and travelers passed by. Gao Qingta gave a few instructions, then led everyone to descend into the town from afar. The disciples looked around, their eyes filled with surprise. They were originally tribal people and had struggled to survive since birth. This was the first time they had come to such a bustling place, and they found it very novel. There were all kinds of people here, and some even spoke barbarian language. They were bare-chested, and their bodies were covered with tattoos. Therefore, the 6 of them did not attract too much attention. Gao Qingtu first led the disciples to a spacious inn. Through the passing merchants, he quickly got a general idea of the situation. After staying for a few days, he led the disciples to the capital city of the great state. Along the way, the scenery, the delicacies, the beautiful clothes, and the enchanting colors were all things the disciples had never seen before. Before this, they had never imagined that they would not even need to lift a finger. All they had to do was pay some useless gold and silver to get enough food to fill their stomachs and clothes that fit them. Moreover, they had Tao techniques on them after all. In just a few days, they had roughly learned the words and language here and could easily understand the scripts and dramas here. These things made a few of them even more intoxicated, and they had a posture of being immersed in it. Gao Chengte looked on coldly, not saying anything. The vanity of the world was just fleeting clouds for those who were really ambitious. If they could not get through this, their Taoist magic would not make any progress. However, there was nothing wrong with chasing after Mu Ronghua. Those who cultivated Taoism had a lifespan of hundreds and thousands of years longer than ordinary people, and they also had the ability to fly in the sky and burrow underground. Of course, most people were not willing to stay in a cave. After enjoying themselves for tens or hundreds of years, some people would see through it and return to the path of Taoism, while others would continue to indulge in it until the end of their lives, only to regret and hate. Those who jumped out could still be called Taoist friends, but those who did not could no longer be considered as his fellow Taoist. However, there was a large population here, which was suitable for preaching Taoism. However, the spiritual opportunity between heaven and earth was abundant, and there might be people who cultivated Taoism, so they had to be careful. Therefore, he simply left the disciples here and said that he was going to visit Taoism. However, this time, even Tan, who was the most respected, did not follow him. He did not care, and once again embarked on the path of seeking Taoism alone. After Zhang Yan had a plan, he used his mighty power to search for the strange power hidden in Bu Shutian's body. This was not something that could be done in a short period of time. It needed to be worn down bit by bit, but in a situation where there was no more strange power seeping in, it was best to expel as much as possible. At the same time, he created a doppelganger out of Bu Tian, and in a flash, he was outside of the mirror lake. Ji Zhuang immediately felt it, and his heart was slightly shaken. He had not seen Zhang Yan for a long time, and his mana was fluctuating. He had been suspicious, but he knew that the other would not disappear for no reason, so he did not make a move. Now that he looked, Zhang Yan was indeed fine, and he must have deliberately reduced his mana. Although he did not know the purpose of this, it was fortunate that he did not act rashly, or else it would have hindered the big plan. It was just that Zhang Yan had never taken the initiative to interact with him, and now that he suddenly came, he did not know what he was going to do. He also sent a doppelganger out to welcome them in. After the host and guest were seated, he then said, "Fellow Taoist, what is the purpose of your visit this time?" Zhang Yan said plainly, "Recently, I have some problems with my cultivation. Because I know that creation Pauline is a spiritual item of creation, and it contains many mysteries, I would like to borrow this item from you to take a look. I wonder if it is possible?" He had already thought it through. If Ji Zhuang was willing to lend it to him, that would be the best. Perhaps he would not need to go to the source of spiritual opportunity anymore. If the person did not lend it to him, then it was all right. With this reason, he would have an excuse to go to the source of spiritual opportunity. Ji Zhuang Daoren was slightly surprised, but at the same time, he was cautious. He did not think that Zhang Yan would make such a request for no reason. He suddenly thought of the collision of the two creation Pauline flowers, and the unfathomable things pouring into the void. He wondered if Zhang Yan really had some understanding of Tao and wanted to borrow Pauline to peek into the upper realm. However, the creation Pauline was his, and it was useless for others to take it. Even if he lent it out, he could take it back at any time, and Zhang Yan would definitely not use it for anything. But after thinking about it, he still decided not to agree. Although this matter did not seem to be a problem, it was inevitable that some things could not be calculated. For example, what ancestor Yao Han did previously had already caused him a lot of trouble. Now that Zhang Yan was Bu Tian's master, and before he recovered his strength, he did not have absolute confidence in going against him, so there was no need for him to meditate. Therefore, he said, I'm afraid this is not appropriate. I am currently using Pauline to cultivate, and it cannot leave my hands for even a moment. However, if I lend you the lotus petal, I will be able to peek into some of its mysteries. Why don't you study it first, and when the time is right, I will lend it to you again. Zhang Yan smiled and said, I was just casually mentioning it. Since it is inconvenient for you, then forget it. After that, he did not mention this matter again. After discussing Dao with Ji Zhuang for a while, he said his goodbyes and left. Ji Zhuang felt that something was wrong, but he could not guess what Zhang Yan wanted to do. Therefore, he became more vigilant and kept an eye on Bu Su Tian's movements, ready to respond if something went wrong. Chapter 2161. Gao Qingtu went out to explore the Dao by himself. In the third year, he unexpectedly discovered that there were also stone tablets that fell in this world and that there were also people who found a way to cultivate the Dao technique on them. He searched along the way and finally found a pair of martial brothers in a famed mountain. One of them was surnamed Huang and the other was surnamed Chu. The Dao technique was passed on to the outside world by the two of them. After meeting the two, he said that he had encountered an obstacle in the cultivation of the Dao technique, so he wanted to seek advice from his fellow Taoists. The martial brothers were also surprised. They didn't think that there would be someone else besides them who had comprehended the Dao technique from the stone tablets. The three of them exchanged a few words and all of them gained a lot. The cultivator surnamed Huang was curious and asked what the difficulty was. Gao Qingtu also raised the question that had been bothering him for a long time. When the cultivator surnamed Huang heard this question, he pondered for a long time before saying, Fellow Taoist, I have also thought about this question before. Ever since Gao Qingtu left the state of Hai Sheng, this was the first time he met someone who thought about this matter like him. He couldn't help but be pleasantly surprised. He solemnly cupped his hands and said, I would like to ask for guidance. The cultivator surnamed Huang said, Our human bodies are formed from heaven and earth and are naturally nurtured by the power of heaven and earth. This power doesn't matter how much it is. All living beings are the same. When one cultivates, the more refined one's cultivation is, the more one can draw upon this power. This is a gift from heaven and all living beings are the same. However, the cultivator surnamed Chu had a different opinion. He said, Senior martial brother's words are incorrect. The human body is limited, but the heaven and earth are infinite. How can one use the limited to see the infinite? Thus, when one ascends to heaven, one must borrow external power. Our cultivation method is also obtained from the outside. Gao Qingtu said, Then what does fellow Taoist Chu think about this? I know that in the past, cultivators used the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. Now, this spiritual energy cannot be used by me. According to what fellow Taoist said, where did this Dao technique come from? The cultivator surnamed Chu said, That will depend on the origin of the Dao art. I believe that this Dao art was bestowed by an immortal in the heavens and not something a mortal could possess. Gao Qingtu nodded. Although the spiritual opportunity of this world was not bad, it should not have flourished for too long. In the past, there were not many outstanding figures, and all the cultivators' sites were limited to this place. There was no concept of the heavens and realms yet, so it was not wrong to attribute the source of the way to the legendary celestials. He also thought that this way was created by some mighty person. Seeing his approval, cultivator Chu became excited and said, If that's the case, then the matter is simple. The power we obtain should all come from that almighty being. Every time we cultivate, we receive a reward from that almighty being. That's how we are able to ascend to the heavens as mortals. Gao Qingtu said thoughtfully, Is that what you think? The cultivator surnamed Chu said in a matter-of-fact manner, Otherwise, where did our Taoist arts come from? As for how that almighty being was able to accomplish such a feat, although it is difficult to understand right now, once our cultivation reaches that level, it will not be difficult to understand. However, since they had an opinion, they naturally had to have evidence to back it up. Otherwise, it would only be a baseless conjecture. Thus, the two of them took out their own understanding of cultivation and verified it with their own theories. After Gao Chengtu heard this, he shook his head. He could feel that what the two of them said was not the true answer. Although the two of them were able to follow their own understanding of the Tao art, sooner or later, they would realize that the Tao art did not conform to their understanding. At that time, although it would not be too big of a problem, it would be difficult for them to advance further. However, even though he hadn't found what he truly wanted, he felt that he had made the right decision to come out and visit this Tao. When more and more people cultivated this Tao technique, presumably there would be someone who had caught a glimpse of the correct path. If there was still no answer in the end, then he could only try to look for the Almighty who had created this Tao technique. Bu Shutian, in the Qinghuan Palace, Zhang Yan opened his eyes. This time, he returned to the Mirror Lake to notify Ji Zhuang. This way, when he went to the place where the spiritual opportunity was flourishing, that person would know what he was going to do and would not immediately start a conflict. However, that existence had a close relationship with Creation Pauline, so he needed to guard against that person coming out to disturb him. However, after his dual strength fusion, his strength had greatly increased. Even if he was alone, it would not be difficult for him to deal with that person. If that person dared to come out, then he did not mind defeating that person again. At this time, he spread out his magic power and left Bu Shutian, heading towards the source of the spiritual opportunity. Although there were layers of obstacles along the way, with the spread of the Weili, he easily cleared them away. Zhizhuang Daoren was sitting on the Mirror Lake altar when he felt the intense waves of the Weili. He immediately looked out and saw that Zhang Yan was heading towards where Creation Pauline was. He was shocked. However, as this thought flashed through his mind, he came to a realization. Zhang Yan hadn't come here to borrow the treasured lotus of fortune in his possession at all. Instead, Zhang Yan had set his eyes on the other lotus since a long time ago, so Zhang Yan had come to notify him in advance. At this time, he also could not sit still. With a flash of his figure, he left the Mirror Lake. When Patriarch Yao Han saw this scene, he was also guessing Zhang Yan's intentions. At this moment, when he saw Zhizhuang Daoren hurrying out, a trace of playfulness appeared in his eyes. Looking at Creation Pauline, Zhang Yan lifted his sleeve and held the Creation Pauline in his hand. Then his mind sank into the remnant of the jade. At the same time, his eyes became deep. At this time, Zhizhuang Daoren's figure suddenly appeared. He looked at the Pauline and cupped his hands. Fellow Taoist, there is no need to do this. This item cannot be touched recklessly. Fellow Taoist, you already know that. In reality, if Zhang Yan insisted on taking this item, he would be the one to suffer in the end. But compared to this, he was more unwilling to see too many variables in the void. However, Zhang Yan said indifferently, "As I said, I only have a question in my mind, so I want to borrow this item to take a look. I don't want to do anything with it." With that, he stretched out his hand and threw Creation Pauline back to where it originally was. Zhizhuang Daoren was startled. He saw that the spiritual qi on the Pauline did not stop. Obviously, Zhang Yan did not even transfer his mana into it. It seemed that he really only wanted to take a look and did not have any other intentions. But deep in his heart, he felt that it was not so simple, so he said, "Creation Pauline is born in response to the creation of heaven and earth. If it collides with each other, it will shake the order of heaven and earth. The rules will no longer exist, and it will not be easy to calm it down. The ripples from the previous time have not calmed down, so this cannot happen again. Otherwise, the consequences will not be what you and I want to see." Just now, Zhang Yan had already obtained what he wanted. He did not say anything to Zhizhuang Daoren. He just nodded to him, waved his sleeve, and returned to Bu Su Tian. When he landed in Qinghuan Palace, he sat down and immediately organized his gains. From the results of the calculation, his previous consideration of using Bu Su Tian to climb to the upper state was feasible. But at the same time, he also saw that Creation Pauline not only gave the cultivator the power to entrust and prevented the foreign Weili from contaminating the body, but it also had another more important function, which was as a step for the cultivator to climb to the third state. Because Creation Pauline itself was of an extremely high level, the intersection of the cultivator and this thing was a process of making up for the flaws and making the body more complete. and it was not feasible to entrust all of this to Bu Su Tian. It was not that Bu Su Tian was inferior to creation Pauline. Purely in terms of Weili, Bu Su Tian was obviously above creation Pauline. It was just that this place of creation essence was not pure. Whether it was the powerful power that permeated it, or the many worlds attached to Bu Su Tian, or even all the living creatures that were born from it, they were all considered flaws. Unless he completely refined it and returned it to its original state, then it could be used. But it was obviously impossible for him to do this. Right now, although there was more than one place of creation around him that he could use, the other places of creation definitely did not have Bu Su Tian as Weili, so it was not enough for him to rely on. But after some calculations, he also understood the profoundness of this, so there was another way. It should be known that he cultivated both qi and strength, and they were both cultivated to the same level. This had never happened among spirit refinement cultivators. In a situation where he really could not find Pauline, he could use his own body of strength as a support, and the qi path Weili interdependent with it. Then, he could use Bu Su Tian as a step to climb to complete this process. This was equivalent to entrusting the originally concentrated effects of creation Pauline to one place separately. In this way, even if the strange power in Bu Su Tian could not be completely eliminated, it would not be too much of a hindrance to him. If this method could be used, then he could walk on an unprecedented path of cultivation. But this path was not easy, because creation Pauline could be completely trusted, and cultivators could also easily peek at the power of the upper level and use it to nourish themselves. But Bu Su Tian was different, because he was a part of the essence of creation. If it was so easy to understand, then he would not have been broken in the past. He could only rely on himself to find a solution. But this did not mean that he had completely given up on looking for creation Pauline. It would be best if he had this thing in hand. Even if he did not use it to increase his cultivation realm, he could use it to fight against his peers or even return Vedanta. After Zhang Yan left, Zhizhuang Daoren also returned to the Mirror Lake, but his expression was solemn. Although the general situation of the void was progressing according to his plan, there were still many things that were difficult to control. For example, when Yao Han used creation Pauline, both Patriarch Yao Han and Zhang Yan gave him a lot of pressure, and he felt a little anxious. He thought to himself, "These people are all scheming. I need to hurry up and draw more power. When the Weili increases a little, then I'll see if I can deal with them." On the other side, although Patriarch Yao Han did not leave the celestial world this time, he also saw the whole process, and he could not help but think. Last time, he borrowed Yuan Mei's hand to make the two creation Pauline collide, which changed the situation of the void to a certain extent, and he also gained some benefits. But now, it seemed that Zhang Yan had also gained something. Although he had regained a portion of his own strength, Ji Zhuang could still continue to strengthen himself with the help of the treasured lotus. Although he could also draw strands of his own strength over to Ji Zhuang, the speed at which he could strengthen himself was definitely not as fast as Ji Zhuang, who had the treasured lotus of good fortune. Therefore, in a prolonged battle, he would definitely be at a disadvantage. Fortunately, he was not someone who would take things one step at a time. When he was secretly helping Yuan Mei, he had already thought of how to act. Originally, he wanted to act a little later, but now he felt that he had no choice but to act in advance. Chapter 2162. With a thought, Ancestor Yao Han's avatar flew out of the Mirror Lake and landed in the real world. After looking for a while, he found a strand of divine intent. He bowed and said, "Fellow Taoist Yuan Ji, wake up." Not long after he finished speaking, traces of mighty power appeared in the divine will, and Yuan Mei's figure appeared. However, compared to before, his figure was much dimmer. He was a creation treasure spirit and had some special abilities. That day, he seemed to have been devoured by that existence, but in reality, he had only lost a part of himself. As long as spirit refinement cultivators were not forced into eternal silence, they could continue to stay in this world. However, that existence had harmed his foundation, so if he wanted to recover his strength, he had to devour his own kind or a creation fragment. He bowed and said helplessly, "What business do you have with me, fellow Taoist?" Ancestor Yao Han smiled. Fellow Taoist, have you forgotten? If I hadn't arranged a backup plan for you, you wouldn't have left your body here. Yuan Ji said angrily, but if I hadn't listened to you, how could I have been found by that existence and ended up like this? I've obviously fallen into your trap. Ancestor Yao Han didn't deny it and admitted, yes, I did use you for my own selfish reasons. But I have to ask, is Ji Zhuang still chasing after you? Right now, he thinks that you've already entered eternal silence, so it's impossible for him to chase after you. I've fulfilled my promise to you, fellow Taoist. That day, I also said that if you managed to escape, you had to come back to help me. Could it be that you're unwilling now? Yuan Ji was speechless. Yao Han's words were both a threat and a favor. Even though he was tricked once, he couldn't deny that Yao Han did help him escape from Ji Zhuang. He smiled bitterly. Fellow Taoist, you must have thought of all this before you acted, right? Ancestor Yao Han smiled. Then, are you willing to help me? Yuan Ji sighed. Forget it. What do you want me to do? But let me say this first, if you want me to appear before Ji Zhuang again, I am not willing. Forefather Yao Han said, since fellow Taoist is free, I won't let you show yourself again. I need you to help me retrieve something. Hearing that he wanted him to take something again, Yuan Mei immediately became alert and asked, what is it? Ancestor Yao Han said solemnly, Fortune Pauline. Yuan Mei was startled, and then he said resentfully, is fellow Taoist joking? Patriarch Yao Han sternly said, I'm not joking. What I need you to find is the treasure lotus that was originally in my possession, not the one you saw outside. You don't need to worry about exposing yourself. Yuan Mei's expression became even more unsightly and he stared at him. Since fellow Taoist already had it, why did you want me to go to the source of the spiritual opportunity? Patriarch Yao Han sighed. Fellow Taoist, this is because I didn't have enough magic power to control it. Even if it fell into my hands, it wouldn't be of much use. Instead, it would attract trouble. But after what happened last time, I've recovered a bit of my power, so I can take it out now. Furthermore, this lotus belongs to me, unlike the one you took last time. It's an ownerless item, so it can't be treated the same way. In fact, he didn't tell the whole truth. His current Dharmakaya was only a part of his original body. Previously, because his strength was still weak, he did not know the whereabouts of this item. As his mighty strength recovered, he naturally knew more. The most important thing was the possible whereabouts of the treasured lotus of fate that originally belonged to him. If he was absolutely certain of its whereabouts, he would immediately obtain it. Unfortunately, if he had to search for it, it would be somewhat troublesome. Ji Zhuang was also extremely vigilant against him, and it was not good to act rashly. Fortunately, he had already anticipated that this would happen, so he left Yuan Mo to serve him. Yuan Mei lowered his head, and after a long time he said, if that's the case, I'm willing to go. I only hope that after I return the favor, you won't come looking for me. Patriarch Yao Han laughed. Fellow Taoist, don't be so dejected. Since I asked you to do this, I'll make it up to you. He took out an item from his sleeve and gave it to Yuan Mei, saying, keep it well, fellow Taoist. Yuan Mei was surprised. A fortune fragment? Patriarch Yao Han said, fellow Taoist's foundation was damaged, and it was because of me, so this item can make up for it. He had already used up all of his fortune fragments, but this one was found by Taoist Yu Qiu not long ago, so he didn't want to give it to Ji Zhuang Daoren. Giving it to Yuan Mei wasn't really compensation. Yuan Mei was still very useful to him, and he still needed him to find Pauline. Moreover, this person was involved in the third step of his plan, so he didn't want anything bad to happen to him. Yuan Mei didn't bother with pleasantries and took it. He felt that this was something he should have, so he didn't put it away. He refined it on the spot, and his body became much more solid. Patriarch Yao Han sent a strand of his divine will to Yuan Mei, saying, then go quickly. With my divine will, as long as you're careful and don't get noticed by Ji Zhuang, there won't be any danger. There's also no need for you to touch Pauline. If you can see it, I can take it. Yuan Mei was relieved to hear that he didn't have to go and take it himself. He sighed, I'll go look for it now. I only hope that fellow Taoist won't scheme against me again. He bowed his head and escaped from this world. He knew that Yao Han was just using him and nothing good could come out of it. In his heart, he was thinking about whether or not he should just run away and not do this anymore. However, if he did so, Yao Han would definitely expose his whereabouts to Ji Zhuang, and he would be hunted down again. Thus, he thought that it would be better to rely on Bu Su Tian. He had even thought of the gift, which was where Yao Han hid the Fate Lotus. His original idea was not bad, and there was even a possibility of success. However, when he wanted to put it into action, his bad habit of worrying about gains and losses and not being able to make a decision occurred again. He was very worried that Yao Han had set up another trap on him, and it was very likely that it would be exposed before he could complete it. After hesitating for a long time, he didn't dare to do so. He comforted himself and went to where Yao Han's divine will was pointing. Jizhuang Daoren sat on the altar. Pauline was shining in front of him, and it was drawing back the original power. Although the increase was very small and almost indiscernible, it was still growing. Right now, his greatest reliance was the treasured lotus of good fortune. Therefore, he had placed all of his attention on it to ensure that the power of this object was increasing at every moment. After a long time, his heart throbbed for no reason. He furrowed his brows. After what happened last time, he didn't dare to neglect any small matters. After pondering for a moment, he waved his sleeve and opened up a barrier. He saw that the soul clone was still trapped under the altar and didn't move at all. He assumed that there wasn't anything unusual happening here. He looked at Bu Su Tian, and there was nothing strange there either. He made some calculations in his mind, but he couldn't find anything. However, he knew that as long as there was this feeling, something must have happened. But since there was no trace of it, he could only wait and deal with it after it happened. After Yuan Mo left, Patriarch Yao Han sat quietly and waited. After an unknown amount of time, he felt the Dharma body's internal energy surge. It felt as if something that was missing had been replenished. His eyes brightened, knowing that Yuan Mo had found what he needed. A thought flashed through his mind as he stretched out his hand. In an instant, a treasured lotus appeared in his hand, and a strand of strange and mighty energy surged out from it. Jizhuang Daoren's expression changed. As the master of the Mirror Lake, he might have overlooked some things that were deliberately concealed, but how could he not sense the appearance of a fortune fragment Pauline? He didn't expect that what he sensed would be something like this, and his expression turned serious. Now that Patriarch Yao Han didn't have a fortune fragment, he was back on the same level as him. After thinking for a while, he arrived at Patriarch Yao Han's residence. Patriarch Yao Han also sensed it and opened the barrier. He looked at Ji Zhuang, stood up and bowed. "What brings you here, fellow Taoist Ji Zhuang?" Taoist Ji Zhuang returned the greeting and said, "Fellow Taoist, I should congratulate you for finding the treasured lotus." Patriarch Yao Han smiled. "It's just an old item. Why do you care so much about it?" Taoist Ji Zhuang glanced at him and said, "This old thing has caused quite a commotion. I wonder what you are here for?" Patriarch Yao Han casually said, "But I'm going to continue cultivating. What else can I do?" Jizhuang Daoren said, "This Mirror Lake is small. It's a bit hard for you to stay here." Ancestor Yao Han knew that Ji Zhuang saw him as the biggest threat after he found the Lotus of Good Fortune. Ji Zhuang didn't dare to keep him in the Mirror Lake, so he wanted to drive him out. He smiled and asked, "What do you think, fellow Taoist?" Jizhuang Daoren said, "There is a fortune fragment outside of the Mirror Lake. I found it last time, and it doesn't have a master yet. It's a good place for you to stay." Ancestor Yao Han's interest was piqued. There's such a place? His original purpose of coming here was to overturn the Ji village and take control of the Mirror Lake. However, he had not been able to find an opportunity to do so. Now that the other party was extremely wary of him, it would be difficult for him to succeed. If there was really a place of fortune that he could hold in his hands, it would not be a problem for him to go there. Taoist Ji Zhuang said, "However, that place is ruled by me and fellow Taoist Xinyuan together. That's why we have never been the master of that place. The two of us will go and I can entrust the other half to you." Forefather Yao Han smirked. "Oh? Only half?" Jizhuang Daoren said, If you think it's inappropriate, I can go with you to Busu Tian and persuade fellow Taoist Xian Yuan to hand over the other half. It shouldn't be difficult. Patriarch Yao Han's eyes flickered. He knew that Ji Zhuang was trying to provoke a conflict between him and Zhang Yan. But if it was for a fortune fragment, it was worth it. Moreover, he could tell that Ji Zhuang was hinting that if the two of them worked together, Zhang Yan might not be able to stop them. If they used this chance to pressure him, it was possible that they could succeed. He chuckled and said, "Since you've said so, why don't we go to fellow Xuanyuan's place and ask him what he thinks?" Chapter 2163. Jizhuang Daoren saw that ancestor Yao Han didn't object to his suggestion, so he invited him out of the mirror lake and to Busu Tian. Zhang Yan felt a strange movement while he was still in his meditation. He looked out and saw that two people had actually arrived together, and each of them was holding a lotus of fortune in their hands. His eyes narrowed. After Jizhuang Daoren found Creation Pauline, he didn't expect ancestor Yao Han to find it as well. From the lotus petal Jizhuang Daoren gave him, he could see that Creation Pauline was attracted to each other. As long as one appeared, he only needed to borrow its aura to find the other Pauline. It seemed like ancestor Yao Han caused such a commotion last time to retrieve this item. While he was thinking, Ji Zhuang and Yao Han arrived outside of Busu Tian. Because the two of them had come in their true forms, he did not invite them into Busu Tian. He also came out in his true form, bowed, and said, "So the two of you have come here. May I know what is the purpose of your visit?" Jizhuang Daoren bowed back, saying, "We came for a matter, but we need your permission." Zhang Yan asked, "What is it?" Not long ago, fellow Taoist Yao Han found Creation Pauline and is no longer afraid of that existence. It isn't appropriate for you to stay under the mirror lake, so you should find another place to stay. Zhang Yan said, "If that's the case, fellow Taoist Yao Han only needs to find a land of creation and stay there." Jizhuang Daoren said, "We don't know how long we'll have to wait, so after discussing with fellow Taoist Yao Han, we came here to ask for a favor." Zhang Yan looked at him and said, "Since you have an idea, why don't you tell me about it?" Jizhuang Daoren said, "Fellow Taoist Yao Han and I found a land of creation. Now that we are divided, there is no master there, so it can be used as a place for fellow Taoist Yao Han to stay. I'm willing to give up my half. What do you think? If you're also willing to give up your half, then this matter can be resolved." Zhang Yan's eyes flashed. He created worlds in the land of creation and imparted Tao to living beings. Because Jizhuang Daoren didn't take the initiative to do this, his half was still empty, so he didn't hesitate to give it up. Of course, losing this wasn't a big loss to him, but since this land belonged to him, he wouldn't give it up easily. He could tell that Ji Zhuang was worried about leaving the Yao Han patriarch in the mirror lake. This was because the Yao Han patriarch was a serious hindrance to Ji Zhuang, especially after the clash with the treasured lotus of good fortune. The two of them had been in conflict for a long time. Now, they both had their own scruples and were unwilling to fall out. Thus, letting Patriarch Yao Han stay in the mirror lake would allow the two of them to keep each other in check, which was very beneficial to Ji Zhuang. Because of this, Ji Zhuang couldn't give up his half of the land. So he said, "What you choose has nothing to do with I. As for the land under I have already made arrangements. It wouldn't be appropriate to give it up." Jizhuang Daoren said, "If I ask fellow Taoists to give it up for no reason, it would be too much. How about this?" He looked at Patriarch Yao Han and said, "Fellow Taoist Yao Han can borrow this land first. When he finds a suitable place, he will return it to fellow Taoist Xian Yuan. What do you think?" Zhang Yan said, "I have no intention of lending it out." Jizhuang Daoren sighed and said, "That's a bit difficult. Fellow Taoist Yao Han, what do you say?" While the two were talking, Patriarch Yao Han didn't say a word. He smiled and said, "Since fellow Taoist Xian Yuan isn't willing, then forget it. It's just a land of creation, and I'll just find another one. I'm sure the two of you won't fight with me for it, right?" Jizhuang Daoren said, "Of course not." Zhang Yan said indifferently, "If fellow Taoist can find it, then it will belong to you." Patriarch Yao Han had Creation Pauline. Although he didn't know how it compared to Jizhuang's, he hadn't used any of his power yet, so the whaley he had must be quite large. If he could find a land of creation, it wouldn't be convenient to fight with him, especially when Jizhuang was watching from the side. Patriarch Yao Han laughed and said, "Then I thank the two of you for your help." He then bowed to Jizhuang Daoren and said, "Before I find a place to stay, I'm afraid I'll have to trouble you for a long time." Jizhuang Daoren said nonchalantly, "Fellow Taoist is too polite. If you don't mind, you can stay for as long as you want." After the discussion, Jizhuang and Yao Han bid farewell to Zhang Yan and returned to Mirror Lake. Zhang Yan watched the two leave, and his eyes darkened. Jizhuang just now hinted to him several times with his divine will, asking him to join forces to deal with Patriarch Yao Han. However, Zhang Yan ignored him. On the surface, the Yao Han Patriarch did not have a place of fortune to rely on. Even if he had the treasure lotus of fortune, he was not necessarily a match for the two of them. They were confident that they could suppress him. However, he believed that if the Yao Han Patriarch dared to come out of the Mirror Lake, he would have a backup plan. Moreover, after understanding the mysteries leading to the third stage, he knew that if the Vedanta personally held Pauline, then when they brought their whaley back, they would have something to rely on and would no longer be able to suppress Zhu Yu. Now that Yao Han had it, the threat to Zhu Yu would be greatly reduced. Zhang Yan didn't need to clash with him now. With a single thought, he returned to Qinghuan Palace and sat down. Then he began to ponder. The two of them each had a lotus in their hands, which meant that their strength was gradually returning. There was also a lotus floating in the air, and he didn't know when the Vedanta behind him would return. He would have to speed up his pursuit of the next stage of cultivation. After discussing Tao with the two cultivators, Gao Qingtu didn't solve the doubts in his heart, but it gave him a lot of inspiration. With the two of them doing their best to invite him, he decided to stay here and spread his Tao in a way that he understood. As his reputation gradually spread, there were always people coming to exchange ideas. Even some of the monarchs in the mortal world who heard that there were 3 immortals with profound Tao here sent envoys to invite them. However, the 3 of them didn't have such thoughts, and each time, they ordered their disciples to send them away. Gao Qingtu stayed here for 20 years. At this moment, he felt that he had gained enough and that it was about time to leave. Thus, he declined Chu Feng and Huang's invitation to stay and went down the mountain. When he was in the mountains, he heard a legend that said that there were immortals here, but they didn't live outside the cloud sky sea. Instead, they lived under the earth. In the ancient records, these people would come to the surface of the earth every few decades to 100 years, and they would often control the situation of the world. However, the last time they came was 1,000 years ago. After that, there were no records of them appearing again. Therefore, he thought that if there were door of 2 realms or ancient cultivators here, then they should be underground. Through the people who came and went to discuss Tao, he finally confirmed the location of the legendary crack in the earth. Therefore, this time, he prepared to go there to explore. Before that, he first went to find the disciples who followed him into this world to see if they were willing to go with him. He first found Tan. This disciple had now changed his name to Zong Tan and held the position of the state preceptor. He was quite respected by the people. When he heard that his teacher was looking for him, he was very happy to welcome him. However, when he heard that Gao Qingtu was going to travel to other worlds, he showed a look of embarrassment. He prostrated on the ground and kowtowed, "I'm afraid that I can't accompany teacher." Gao Qingtu was silent for a moment and said regretfully, "Forget it, you can get up." Zong Tan looked ashamed, but he refused to get up. He said, "I also know that the human world is the swamp of the mortal world that teacher talked about. However, once I fell into it, it is already difficult to get out. My Tao heart is not strong, I have really disappointed teacher." He didn't want to leave, not only for himself. Now, he also had children and a group of disciples. These people were all relying on him, so he couldn't leave them behind and leave. Gao Qingtu knew that this matter couldn't be forced. Moreover, if he forced him to cut off his mortal fate, it would be too unreasonable. He sighed and said, "Everyone has their own aspirations. I won't blame you for this. However, I'm afraid that the fate between you and me as teacher and disciple has ended here. Zhong Tan just prostrated on the ground and didn't say a word. Gao Qingtu shook his head and retreated. After that, he met with the remaining disciples one by one. Even those disciples who had been separated were not difficult to find because they had made a name for themselves in these years. However, these disciples either had something to worry about or were blinded by the riches and honor of the mortal world. None of them were in the mood to seek Tao. In the end, only one disciple expressed that he was willing to go with him. This disciple's name was Agua. When he came from the ocean, the first people he saw were Agua and Atan. And after he came here, he still maintained his original simple and honest nature. He was also the only one among the disciples who didn't lose his Tao heart and didn't change his name. Gao Qingtu said with emotion, "I didn't expect that in the end, it was you, Agua, who was willing to go with me." This disciple's aptitude was ordinary. When others performed one round, he often had to repeat it several times or even dozens of times before he could keep up. His cultivation was also always ranked at the bottom and never attracted attention. But instead, he was the one with the strongest Tao heart. He thought for a moment and said, "Agua, since you and your fellow disciples all have names, you shouldn't be an exception. From now on, how about you follow my surname?" Gao Gua smiled honestly and touched his head. He said, "If teacher thinks it's good, then it's good." Gao Qingtu said, "Once we go, I'm afraid it'll be difficult for us to return. Do you want to bid farewell to your fellow disciples?" Gao Gua shook his head. When Gao Qingtu wasn't around, he had been cultivating diligently. In the beginning, there were fellow disciples who came to persuade him not to do so. There were plenty of pleasures in the world to enjoy. Later, seeing that he insisted on it, they didn't persuade him anymore. Because the path they were on was different, they had long since broken off contact. Gao Qingtu nodded and looked in a direction. He said, "The path of cultivation is long. You and I, master and disciple, still have a long way to go. Let's go." When the master and disciple finished speaking, they immediately soared up and flew towards the location of their target. But after a dozen days, they saw a ravine that seemed to have split the earth. Gao Qingtu took a few glances and couldn't help but reveal a shocked expression. With his eyesight, he could naturally see that this was not natural, but man-made. It looked like it had experienced countless years. But the more it was like this, the more it meant that there was something he was looking for below. So he called out to Gao Gua and went down into the deep ravine. Chapter 2164. In the Qinghuan Palace, Zhang Yan was thinking about what to do next. Just now, if he could reach the third stage before Ji Zhuang and Yao Han, his original plan of slowly wearing it down could no longer be used. He had no choice but to take some drastic measures. He felt that he still needed to continue searching for the creation Pauline, but he could not rely on it. Now, he could only act according to the previous steps, and the first thing to do was to eliminate the strange power in Bu Su Tian's body. In reality, the strange power did not necessarily have to be completely eliminated, but the more it remained, the more hindrance it would cause to him in comprehending the upper realm, so he had to eliminate it as much as possible. As the master of Bu Su Tian, he could use the Weili at will, but he could only control the power of the yang side. With the completion of the strength body, the power of the yin and yang sides were in his hands, and he was able to combine the two forces. So the simplest method now was to stir the power of the yin and yang and return to the chaos. This way, no matter what kind of strange power was left here, it would be easily eliminated. Even if you hit it, it would be useless. Then, he could move on to the next step without worry. However, not to mention the living beings in the universe, even his teachers, disciples, and friends were here, so he could not just ignore them, so he had to take a few more steps. After thinking about it, he immediately took action. With a wave of his sleeve, he divided the universe into 3 parts. The world with cultivators was the upper part, the world with ordinary living beings was the middle part, and the world without living beings was the lower part. With another thought, the yin and yang power of Bu Su Tian stirred, and in an instant, the lower part without living beings was returned to chaos. He felt some resistance, and knew that it was the resistance of the strange power. It was just that the foreign force that invaded the lower parts should only be a small amount of power that flowed out from the original mighty power. Moreover, it was scattered and did not gather. In addition, the places that it invaded were all lifeless. Therefore, it did not give birth to any independent consciousness and was easily cleansed. When there was no longer any force in the lower part, he began to deal with the middle part. Because there were living beings here, the Whaley that was emitted blended with one's thoughts, desires, and even spiritual vigor. It stimulated all sorts of demonic gods and ferocious monsters in one's divine thoughts. They were like old roots that penetrated deep into the heavens. After the spiritual vigor flourished, there were already signs of them gradually manifesting. Fortunately, these lands were barren. Even if the spiritual vigor rose, it was extremely weak. Moreover, there were no cultivators here. Mortals could not live for more than 100 years and their thoughts were not condensed. As long as he cut off the roots, it would not take long before he used the Whaley to cover and suppress it. Then, the remaining poison would dissipate. He stretched out a finger. At this moment, all of the creatures froze, as if they had lost all changes in the past and future. Then, he directly began to seize the world around them. This time, the resistance was even greater than before. However, it didn't bring him much trouble. After the world was turned into chaos, it reappeared with a single thought, and everything returned to its original state. These living beings also moved again. However, they had no idea that in that instant, the world that they were in had already experienced a change. After Zhang Yan easily settled these two places, he shifted his gaze to the upper part. This was the place where the strange force truly resided. It was entangled with the living beings more deeply. As long as the living beings did not die, it would be difficult to eliminate them completely. Moreover, some of the strange forces were higher than his own level. Even if he were to return to chaos, it would probably take him a lot of effort. It was even possible that his power would be restrained here. However, there was still a way here. Especially when Zhizhuang Doran's action of severing the original Dao technique, it gave him a chance. Gao Qingtu sank into the gully. At first, there was light accompanying him. However, as he gradually went deeper, the surroundings became dark. The darkness was very strange. Logically speaking, as a cultivator, he could see the night as if it was day. However, after entering this place, he seemed to have lost this ability. At this moment, Gao Guo's figure also became blurry. She said, "Teacher, I can't see where you are anymore." Gao Qingtu took out a pearl from his sleeve. It was originally very dim. He raised his hand and rubbed it a few times. In an instant, a ball of gentle light bloomed and illuminated everything within 100 feet. However, there was still a ball of darkness in front of him. It was enough to show that the place where he could land was still very far away. After sinking for an unknown amount of time, the two of them finally went underground. Gao Qingtu looked around and found that whether it was the ground or the wall in the distance, they were all very neat. It was obvious that someone had built this place. He said, "Gao Guo, later, follow me. Be careful. Don't touch anything around you." Gao Guo said, "Teacher, I'll listen to you." However, it turned out that he was worrying too much. This place had long been abandoned for who knew how many years. Only empty stone altars and towering palaces were left. Apart from that, there was nothing else. After Gao Qingtu looked around, he was already certain that the records about the ancient immortals living here should be about right. Under this kind of underground, if one didn't have the supernatural power of strength, it would be impossible to build such a grand city. He could see that the people here should have left on their own. When they left, they could be said to be very calm. They took away everything that could be taken away. There were no scattered items left behind. The teacher and disciple walked and stopped in this gully. After traveling for about half a year, they had just now reached the end. It was different from what they had imagined. There were no altars or palaces here. There were only stone tablets that densely covered the entire platform. They were engraved with words. Gao Guo took a few glances and found that she didn't recognize them. She asked, "Teacher, what is written on them?" Gao Qingtu said, "These should be the ancient words of this world." "Let me see." He had also stayed here for more than 20 years. Not only was he familiar with the languages of various countries, he was also proficient in the ancient language recorded in the ancient books. What he saw on the stone tablet was one that he recognized. Thus, he pointed to the largest stone tablet and said, "It says that the earthly treasure's celestial kingdom has been prosperous for 15,000 years. However, there are many cultivation sects in the kingdom, and it is difficult to determine who is superior. Due to the endless fighting, there is no law in the kingdom to rely on." Thus, the king gathered the vassals in the north and south, and wanted to have a debate to determine who is superior. "The final winner will be the law." Gao Guo listened attentively. Seeing that he stopped, she couldn't help but ask, "What happened next?" Gao Qingtu said, "I don't know why, but the words were erased." He looked at the stone tablets behind him. "Let me look elsewhere and see if I can find more there." Just as he was about to take a step forward, he seemed to have thought of something. He paused and said, "This language isn't difficult. I'll teach you now. It'll be convenient for you to look around here." Gao Guo nodded repeatedly. Therefore, with so many ancient words to refer to, Gao Qingtu dictated this language on the spot. Gao Guo was a Taoist cultivator after all, so she was different from mortals. Even though she had a simple temperament, it was not difficult for her to learn a language. After a day, she had learned most of it and could look at the stone tablets as she pleased. Gao Qingtu also let him go, while he himself directly walked towards the back. As he walked, he discovered that the stairs here gradually rose upwards, and with one look, he could tell that the most important thing was placed there. In the end, his path was blocked by a large tablet that was half embedded in the stone wall. On the tablet was a Tao art, and there was even a note beside it. However, he sighed when he looked at it. In such a hurry, it was hard for him to know if this Tao technique was brilliant or not. However, he could tell that this technique was still using spiritual opportunity to cultivate. He could imagine that perhaps this earth treasure immortal country had established the law in the end. However, not long after, the Tao technique between heaven and earth was cut off. Everything became useless. However, the notes were very interesting. Even though some of the techniques were different, some of the principles were the same. He couldn't help but be engrossed in it. His gaze finally stopped at a paragraph of description. There was a sentence, "Wherever the heart shines, heaven and earth will be formed." When he saw these words, a light flashed in his mind. He muttered a few words and paced a few times on the spot, muttering to himself, "According to this, could it be that the power of Emowa is obtained like this?" After a while, the mana on his body suddenly rose and he stepped into a brand new realm. After so many years of cultivation, he had a deep understanding of this Tao technique. His accumulation could be said to be strong. Now that the doubts in his heart were gone, he almost crossed this threshold in one step. He knew that what he comprehended just now might not be really correct. However, who could really understand everything in the world? He just needed to get an answer that he was convinced of. To seek Tao was to seek confirmation. Those things could be found in the future. Gao Guo noticed something strange and quickly flew over. She asked anxiously, "Master?" Gao Qingtu smiled. "I'm fine. I just got rid of a doubt in my heart." He looked at a hidden gap on the side of the mountain wall. "Let's take a look there. According to my guess, the people from the Earth Treasure's celestial kingdom left from there. If we're lucky, we might be able to leave this world." Ancestor Yao Han returned to the Mirror Lake and said goodbye to Jizhuang Daoren. He returned to his residence and brought Pauline in front of him. Currently, most of the power of the Lotus of Good Fortune in Taoist Jizhuang's hands was used to sever the Tao law and re-establish the rules of the world. Hence, there was almost no restriction on him. Hence, he could now proceed with the third step of his plan. His next step was still on Yuan Mei. He didn't know where this person went after retrieving Creation Pauline for him. Obviously, he was hiding and didn't want to meet him again. However, this was useless. Since this person was involved in his plan, how could he let him go so easily? But before he found this person again, he still had to do one thing. He reached out and touched Pauline. In an instant, a light rose. He then closed his eyes as if he was looking for something. After a moment of silence, he said, "This is it." He raised Pauline and waved it in a certain direction. In an instant, an extremely weak force was drawn out from the depths of the void. Chapter 2165. After the Whaley was drawn out, it gathered into a ball of qi. Moments later, it transformed into the figure of an old cultivator, but he seemed to be in a deep slumber. Seeing this, Patriarch Yao Han knew it was a success. Back when the Vedantas were still around, it wasn't as if there weren't fortune treasure spirits in power. The one he was drawing out was one of them. However, after the fortune essence was destroyed, it also left the world, leaving only a remnant of the Whaley in the void. Using Fortune Pauline, he could try to call back a portion of its power. He didn't want to help this one resurrect. Even with Pauline in hand, he couldn't return to his Whaley and take care of another spirit refinement cultivator at the same time. Therefore, he only wanted to temporarily bring it back. Moreover, the consciousness in the Whaley was firmly suppressed by Pauline. Yuan Mo was a fortune treasure spirit, so the appearance of the Whaley here would definitely attract his attention. If he could seize the opportunity to devour it, his strength would increase greatly. Perhaps it wouldn't be long before he reached the second stage. If that happened, that existence would be stimulated, and even if he didn't retrieve his consciousness, his strength would still skyrocket. If Jizhuang Daoren didn't suppress it in time, then the Tao laws that he worked so hard to protect would no longer exist. In this way, he would achieve his goal of restraining that existence. However, there was one more thing. To ensure that the treasure spirit wouldn't fall into Yuan Mo's hands and not be dealt with by that existence or Jizhuang, he had to conceal the Whaley so that it wouldn't be discovered as soon as it came out. Therefore, when he summoned the lotus again, he was able to separate the majority of the ripples from the magical energy. After finding Fortune Pauline, Yuan Mo fulfilled his promise. Thereafter, he hid in the various realms, afraid that ancestor Yao Han and Jizhuang would find him. Fortunately, neither of them came looking for him, which made him feel a little more at ease. However, at that moment, the mighty people's magic power rippled all over the void, and they were all searching for the place where the essence of creation was stored. In order to avoid being affected by these magic power ripples and accidentally revealing his tracks, he could only force himself to fall into a deep sleep. His qi activity was almost non-existent, mixed with the many weak Whaley, and there was nothing eye-catching about him. But in that case, it would be impossible for him to improve his cultivation. He didn't have any extravagant demands, and he would be satisfied as long as he could ensure that he could drag out an ignoble existence and not be forced into eternal silence. At this moment, not only was his aura restrained, even his consciousness was almost frozen. But at this moment, a wave of magic power rippled over, and he couldn't help but wake up. He couldn't help but peek at the source of the magic power. As a treasure spirit, he almost immediately realized that this magic power should be from someone of the same kind. Moreover, it seemed that the body that existed in this world had already been born, but its consciousness had yet to be fully awakened. This caused an extremely strong attraction to him, and for a moment he became restless. He couldn't help but think that if he could swallow this fortune treasure spirit, not only would he be able to make up for his previous losses, his strength would also increase. But just as he was about to take action, the figures of Jizhuang and Yao Han flashed across his mind, and he hesitated. What if he attacked this time, and not only did he not achieve his goal, but he was also discovered by those two? In the end, wouldn't he not only fail to reap the benefits, but also lose his own life? After thinking about it, he finally decided to take a risk. This was because the treasure spirit didn't seem to have any power to resist. If he succeeded, even if Jizhuang discovered him again, he would still have the power to fight back. The main thing was that he didn't have the confidence to hide for a long time. Instead, if he succeeded this time, he would have the capital to fight against Jizhuang, Yao Han, and the others. At least he wouldn't be casually manipulated by them. Once he made up his mind, he thought about it and followed the direction of the magic power. In a flash, he came close to it, and saw that the consciousness really hadn't been born. At this time, he didn't hesitate anymore, and with a light breath, that ball of Whaley essence qi was sucked in, and in a flash, it was absorbed into his body. And with this sudden nourishment, his own aura suddenly rose, and the magic power rippled out involuntarily. Taoist Jizhuang was now extremely sensitive to even the slightest movement in the void. He was afraid that something unexpected would happen. Now that he felt the fluctuation of the dermic power, he looked over and immediately saw the owner of the dermic power. He was surprised. He thought that Yuan Mo had already been swallowed by that existence, but he didn't expect that Yuan Mo would still exist in the void. It seemed that Yuan Mo's magic power had increased, and this was something he couldn't tolerate. He reached out and the boundless Weili essence chi fell towards Yuan Mo. After obtaining the benefits, Yuan Mo immediately went into hiding. Seeing this, Ancestor Yao Han revealed a smile. He waved the Pauline essence chi, concealing his tracks. This way, it would be even more difficult for Jizhuang to track him down. Right now, his main opponents were Zhang Yan and Jizhuang. Although Zhang Yan could be considered an opponent, Ancestor Yao Han didn't think that Zhang Yan was originally a great virtue, and he didn't have the creation Pauline essence chi, so it was impossible for him to reach the upper realm. Moreover, these treasures all had owners. Even if they were scattered all over the void, it wouldn't be easy to find them. Therefore, in his heart, compared to Jizhuang Daoren, the threat of Zhang Yan was ranked lower. More importantly, Jizhuang Daoren was already ahead of him. Ancestor Yao Han had to think of a way to delay him and prevent his power from returning. Only then would he have a chance to catch up. Zhang Yan could also see the fluctuations of transcendence energy from within the Qinghuan Palace. However, this power appeared rather abruptly, as if it had appeared out of nowhere. There was definitely someone behind this, and there were only a few people who could cause such a commotion. It was not difficult for Zhang Yan to guess that this was the work of the Yao Han patriarch. He didn't care much about this, and continued to seize the opportunity to wear down the strange power in the upper heavens of the void. Ever since the Tao techniques were cut off in the void, people who came later could no longer obtain magic power by breathing in spiritual vigor. This meant that the strange power that was entangled with spiritual vigor could no longer infect this generation. However, if left unchecked, these strange power would change after a long time. Therefore, the most suitable method, which wouldn't cause any major turmoil, was to replace it with another kind of power. He was prepared to let these living beings believe in the Tao techniques that he had created. Then, under his Weili protection, he would be able to repel the strange power. As for the Tao techniques that Jizhuang had sent in, he didn't want to deal with them so soon. However, since he wanted to eliminate as much of the foreign power as possible, there was no need to leave them behind. He had to clean them up in this operation. However, due to a certain reason, he had to avoid interfering too much. Otherwise, it might go against his original intention. Therefore, he couldn't force the living beings to believe in this Tao. It was best to choose suitable people to pass on the Tao. There were many suitable candidates here, but the one who had the most hope of entering the upper realm was Gao Qingtu. At this moment, he had already gotten rid of the doubts in his heart, and his understanding of this Tao technique wasn't something that his peers could compare to. When he thought of this, he already had a plan. With a flick of his finger, a spiritual light fell and disappeared into the present world. Gao Qingtu brought Gao Guo to the gap in the stone wall. It looked very narrow from the outside, but when they got inside, they realized that it was a wide path. He looked at his feet, reached out, and picked up a jade pendant. This should have been left here by someone who was in a hurry to leave. After he and Gao Guo walked for a few days, there was a high platform in front of them, surrounding a tall tower. Rainbow bridges connected from all directions to the top. He said, "Let's go to the top of the tower to take a look." Although there weren't any restrictions or formations along the way, he didn't fly up to avoid being surprised. Instead, he first went to the surrounding platforms, followed the rainbow bridges, entered the tower, and followed the stone steps to the top of the tower. As soon as they entered the empty hall at the top, the master and disciple noticed that there was a big ring built with jade stones in the middle. Gao Qingtu took a few careful glances, then looked at the layout of the surroundings, and said with certainty, "The people of the earthly treasures celestial kingdom really withdrew from here." He guessed that the spiritual vigor of this place must have died out, and the 100 Daos were destroyed. Therefore, the people of the kingdom wanted to escape from this world. Unfortunately, the Tao technique was not a matter of one world, but of all worlds. Therefore, no matter where they went, if they didn't find a new technique, they wouldn't be able to change the situation. His gaze turned again, and this time, he noticed that there were some strange instruments placed around him. He walked to the front, picked up those things and roughly knew what they were. They were most likely the two realms dial. If the Taoist who guarded the altar hadn't mentioned them to him, he wouldn't have been able to recognize them. This showed that the people of the earthly treasure's celestial kingdom were not simple and had some background. Otherwise, they wouldn't have needed something like this to communicate with other worlds. However, this was good news for him. A world with such an item would definitely be overseen by an almighty upper realm expert. Perhaps that person would be able to communicate with heaven and earth in the outside world, and perhaps he could use it to return to the mountain and sea realm. He put the dial back to its original place, then walked to the center and looked around. He knew that this place needed to be reconnected with spiritual vigor to activate the two realms gate. The amount of spiritual vigor required here was not small. Fortunately, after a quick inspection, he found that these people from the celestial kingdom had been gone for at least 1,000 years, and the spiritual vigor had always been accumulating. However, no one was in control of the core, so after a certain point, the spiritual vigor would automatically disperse and would not overflow. Now, all he needed to do was remove this obstacle, and the spiritual vigor would once again flow. The restrictive spells here were not complicated, and he carefully fiddled with them. After about 10 days, the top of the pagoda first trembled, and then a curtain of spiritual light rose up. Gao Qingtu knew that the spiritual vigor here would only last for a moment. If he didn't do it now, he would have to wait for another 1,000 years. Therefore, without any hesitation, he grabbed Gao Gua and threw himself into the room. After a moment of absent-mindedness, his feet touched the ground again. When he looked around, he found that he was on an altar, and there were two Taoists standing guard there. At this moment, they were looking at them with vigilant eyes. The Taoist in the lead asked bluntly, "Who are you? And where did you come from?" Chapter 2166. After swallowing the treasure spirit's essence, Yuan Mo immediately retracted his aura. At the same time, he constantly moved around the modern realm to avoid being pursued. Originally, he thought that this would be another endless chase. However, he did not expect that just by hiding a little, he would successfully escape from Ji Zhuang's Fa Li. Then he used all his strength to retract his qi. But when he calmed down, he realized that just now, someone was helping him. Otherwise, how could he have escaped from Ji Zhuang so easily? He guessed that this was the doing of Patriarch Yao Han. Although he didn't know why, he was certain that Patriarch Yao Han was up to no good. Although it looked like he owed him a favor, he didn't take the initiative to ask for it. Right now, all he could think about was getting as far away from the two of them as possible. He didn't want to be dragged into the vortex of their battle. As Ji Zhuang was about to attack, he was blocked by a Wei Li. His magic power missed, and when he looked again, he lost track of Yuan Mo. He knew that this was Ancestor Yao Han's interference, and he frowned. However, the other party's power was retracted as soon as it came into contact. It hadn't crossed the bottom line in his heart, so he snorted and pretended nothing had happened. He couldn't let go of a good fortune treasure spirit that had escaped from the outside world. If this person found another of his kind to devour, causing that existence's Wei Li to increase, then the great virtue behind it might return early. Right now, he was using the good fortune Pauline's power to isolate other laws and suppress the cultivation of others. He had used up a lot of his power and couldn't draw out much more. He also had to leave some power to guard against others, so he could only rely on his own Wei Li to deal with this. He thought about it, then used his magic power to form a letter and sent it to Bu Shutian. He hoped that Zhang Yan would help him kill this person. In truth, he didn't have much hope and was just trying. When Patriarch Yao Han saw Ji Zhuang writing to Zhang Yan, he narrowed his eyes and chuckled. He believed that Zhang Yan would be happy to see such a scene, just like him. Therefore, he wouldn't interfere. Unless Yuan Mo's cultivation had really skyrocketed, directly entering the second stage realm. However, regardless of whether it was internal or external, he had to get past Jezhen. Based on Yuan Mo's temperament, how could he get past her so easily? Even if he passed, where would he get the resources to enter the second stage realm? Moreover, if the three of them felt threatened, even if they didn't send a letter to ask for help, they would definitely take the initiative to suppress this person. Thus, this person had no chance at all. Hence, at this moment, he suddenly thought of a possibility that he had overlooked before, and his expression also became somewhat serious. He secretly circulated his mana to calculate for a while, and thought to himself, although there is no result, perhaps I should be more careful. I need to know that the other generation may not necessarily be content with their lot. After receiving the letter from Ji Zhuang, Zhang Yan used his magic power to disperse it after reading it. He also understood that Yuan Mo was originally a chess piece in the battle between Yao Han and Ji Zhuang, so there was no need for him to interfere. To him, that existence was the source of danger. As long as he made sure that he didn't attract the Vedanta back, it would be fine. Moreover, the more the two fought, the less time they would have to worry about him. He could use this opportunity to quickly make Bushutian a stepping stone for him to ascend to the third stage realm. Although he had previously peered into the depths of Bushutian and learned many mysteries from it, at that time, the Yin and Yang Qi hadn't merged yet. Moreover, his main goal was to become Bushutian's master, so he neglected some things that weren't very important at that time. And after receiving the consciousness transmitted by the Vedanta, he discovered that there were still many things that he didn't understand, and he still needed to go back and sort them out. He calculated once more. Within around 100 years, the Tao art he'd passed down would welcome an opportunity to flourish, and so long as it was maintained well, it would be able to slightly isolate the strange energy. But he was unable to interfere too much here, and it depended on how far the Tao art seed could go. Gao Qingta had passed through the world pass several times, but this was the first time he saw people guarding outside the border pass. However, the words of these people were somewhat similar to the people of the original world pass, so they might be the remnant people of the Earth Treasure Celestial Kingdom who had retreated here. He deliberated over his words and said, I came from the original Celestial Kingdom. The leading Taoist didn't understand at first, but then his expression changed. He looked at him a few more times and said, You wait here. He signaled for his companions to watch over Gao Qingtu and his disciple, and he hurriedly left the spell altar. About an hour later, the person turned back, and his tone was slightly more polite. The two of you, please follow me. Gao Qingtu didn't resist, and only transmitted his voice to Gao Gua, saying, Don't act rashly without my orders. Gao Gua nodded repeatedly. The two of them left the spell altar and came to a pavilion below the altar. This place looked like it was used to receive people coming and going. The layout was spacious, and the decorations were bright and beautiful. There were even curtains used to block off the wind and sand, and on both sides of the walkway stood strong men. Gao Gua could feel that the gazes of the people around them were very unfriendly, and she transmitted her voice. Teacher, this group of people doesn't have good intentions. Gao Qingtu said, Don't be afraid, let's see what they want to do first. Now that they were on the other side's boundary, there might be some great divine arts practitioners here. If they were to fall out with them, there was nowhere to run, so it was better to see the situation first. Not long after, the Taoist brought the two of them into the main hall, and an elder sat there. He didn't invite the two of them to sit down, and asked in a deep voice, Are you the remnant people of the Earth Treasure Celestial Kingdom? Gao Qingtu straightened up and replied, Thank you for asking, elder. We are not the remnant people of the Earth Treasure Celestial Kingdom. That elder said, Oh? Didn't you come here from the old site of the Earth Treasure Celestial Kingdom? Gao Qingtu said, My teacher and disciple went out to seek the Tao, and along the way, we went to many boundaries, and just happened to find the gate of 2 realms left behind by the old capital of the Celestial Kingdom, so we used it to cross and came here. The Taoist scolded, Nonsense. If you aren't the remnant people of the Earth Treasure Celestial Kingdom, then you don't know where that gate leads to, and you dare to cross it? Gao Gua said with dissatisfaction, My teacher went to many worlds to seek the Tao, So why would he shrink back in front of a gate? Hearing their words, the elders somewhat believed them. It turned out that the people of the Earth Treasure Celestial Kingdom only referred to the Gate of Two Realms as the Gate of Heaven, but they never had the concept of the Gate of Two Realms. In their eyes, there were only three realms. However, he didn't hastily come to a conclusion and asked, "Then let me ask you. You said you came to seek the Tao, so where did you come from?" Gao Chengtu replied, "I am from the Xing nation of the mountain and sea realms' eastern wastelands. Have you heard of me, elder? When I was seeking the Tao, I happened to see the Gate of Two Realms erected by someone before me. Afraid that I would miss the opportunity, I entered it, and then crossed the two realms. Just now I'm here." When the elder heard his story, he couldn't help but feel strange. He shook his head and said, "I've never heard of the mountain and sea realm. Since you aren't the remnant people of the Earth Treasure Celestial Kingdom, then I won't make things difficult for you. Leave your names on the register, and then you may leave." Gao Chengtu stepped forward and wrote down his and Gao Guo's names. Just as he was about to leave, he asked, "Elder, you've mentioned the Earth Treasure Celestial Kingdom several times. When I arrived, all that was left of the Earth Treasure Celestial Kingdom were abandoned. What happened to the people of the Earth Treasure Celestial Kingdom in the end?" The elder casually said, "That generation called themselves the Celestial Kingdom. They have already been destroyed by the Great Liang sect, and not a single remnant of their people remains." Gao Chengtu came to a sudden realization. It seemed like those people from the Earthly Treasure's immortal kingdom had not only failed to find a place to stay after arriving in this region, but they had also suffered an even greater setback. The people seated here did not conceal anything about this matter. Presumably, it would not be difficult to find out the specifics of the situation once they left. Seeing that there was nothing else to do, he clasped hands in salute and left with Gao Guo. The Taoist asked, "Why did you believe them, Altar Lord?" The elder said with certainty, "Those two are definitely not the people of the Earth Treasure Celestial Kingdom." The Taoist asked, "How can you be so sure, Altar Lord?" The elder said, "Because the people of the Earth Treasure Celestial Kingdom have lived underground for tens of thousands of years, and their auras are more yin and turbid. But those two people have yang and righteous auras. Clearly, they aren't from the same path. Furthermore, that person is at most a few hundred years old, but his magic power is even higher than mine." The Taoist said in disbelief, "But Taoist magic can't be cultivated." As he said this, he suddenly became excited. Could it be that the mountain and sea realm behind him can still cultivate Taoist magic? The elder's eyes also shone brightly. He said, "That's exactly what I want to know. I'll go back to this realm and report this matter to the great Dharma Master. Keep an eye on those two for me, but don't do anything drastic. Everything will be decided when I return." After Gao Chengtu left the altar, he didn't leave immediately. Instead, he walked around the area, trying to understand the situation. Only then did he learn that the Gate of Two Realms owned by the people of the Earth Treasure Celestial Kingdom wasn't built by themselves. It was left behind by an unknown almighty being, and it wasn't just one. It was spread across three realms, and thus formed three great celestial kingdoms. They interacted with each other, and each flourished for tens of thousands of years. However, because the spiritual opportunity at that time was very weak, no almighty cultivators had ever emerged from those three realms. The Earth Treasure Celestial Kingdom wasn't very lucky either. Originally, its magic had been lost, and its Taoist magic had been cut off. It had gone through untold hardships to move into this part of the world in hopes of extending its destiny. However, it wasn't long before they were attacked by the Great Liang sect. Although it was difficult to determine how powerful that foreign sect was, they were able to easily wipe out the three celestial kingdoms. From what Gao Chengtu could tell, the sect was most likely facing a situation where their Taoist magic had been cut off, and they were relying on medicinal pills and the like to survive. Perhaps that was why they had no choice but to search everywhere for a way out. Unfortunately, it was destined to be a fruitless effort. Having reached this point in his train of thought, he couldn't help but wonder, doesn't that mean this is a good place to spread the Tao? Although he had already resolved his doubts about the Taoist magic, It was hard to say whether it was correct or not. If he wanted to move forward, he would need more people of the same Tao. If the Great Liang sect could travel through the heavens, then perhaps they could find a way back to the mountain and sea realm. With these thoughts in mind, he turned to Gao Gua and said, "Apprentice, we won't be leaving tomorrow." Gao Gua said, "Isn't Master going to look for a way back to the mountain and sea realm?" Gao Chengtu laughed. "There's no need to look for one. Besides, we can't leave anyway. In a few days, someone will come looking for us." Chapter 2167. Gao Chengtu's judgment was spot on. 2 days later, a disciple from the Duliang sect came to invite master and disciple for a meeting. Since it was a friendly invitation, Gao Chengtu gladly accepted. A cultivator by the name of Fu Mingdan was waiting for the two of them at the same place from many days ago. However, this time, a banquet was set up. This person said that he came from the headquarters of Daliang sect, and he was ordered by the sect to ask the two of them some questions. Fu Mingdan invited them to the banquet, and after a few rounds of toasting he asked, "Fellow Taoist Gao, your aura is vigorous, and your life force is overflowing. It seems that you have cultivated for less than 500 years? Gao Chengtu answered truthfully, "Yes." Fu Mingdan said, "Then may I ask if the Taoist magic of the place you came from has changed?" Gao Chengtu replied, "It was the same as where you came from. It was severed a long time ago. According to what I've heard, an almighty being from the realm said that it was the same for all the heavens and the myriad realms. There are no exceptions. So that's how it is." Fu Mingdan's expression became somewhat complicated. After a moment of silence, he asked the key question. "The Taoist magic of the realm has been severed for more than 1,000 years. Fellow Taoist, you've only cultivated for a few hundred years. Where did you get your magic power from? More than 1,000 years?" Gao Chengtu didn't think that he had cultivated for more than a few hundred years. However, he knew that perhaps the flow of time in the myriad realms was different, or perhaps it was because he had passed through the realm passes several times. Based on his abilities, he couldn't figure it out, so there was no need to think too much about it. He said, "I am from the mountain and sea realm. After the Taoist magic of the realm was severed, a stone steel descended from the heavens to bestow upon me superior magic. Almighty beings from the various sects established new magic. By the time I left, I knew that there were more than 10 Taoist magic that could be passed on." Fu Mingdan was a bit surprised and then excited. There are so many Taoist magic? It was no wonder that he reacted this way. After the Duliang sect's Taoist magic was severed, the disciples could only rely on medicinal pills to forcibly increase their magic power. They had long since fallen into the predicament of having no successor. Suddenly hearing that there were so many Taoist magic in the mountain and sea realm was like seeing a bright future. "In that case, fellow Taoist," he said, looking Gao Chengtu in the eye, "how do I get to the mountain and sea realm?" At this time, Gao Chengtu asked, "Does fellow Taoist know about the inner world?" Fu Mingdan asked curiously, "I have never heard of it. Where is it?" Gao Chengtu knew that since this person was not in the inner world, then perhaps the realm he was in should not be among the 4 Yuanzun's subordinates. So he explained a little, saying that it was a realm created by a powerful person. If a cultivator could enter it, he could be protected by the powerful person and prolong his life. Fu Mingdan was even more shocked. He had never imagined that there would be a place like this. What kind of grandeur was this? What kind of divine ability was this? In the blink of an eye, his image of the mountain and sea realm rose to a whole new level. He rose to his feet, bowed deeply, and then said, "Fellow Taoist, could you tell us how to get to the mountain and sea realm? The Great Liang sect will definitely reward you handsomely." Gao Chengtu hurriedly stood up. He shook his head and said, "You're being too serious. I came out to seek Tao with the intention of never returning. Now, I don't know how to return, or else I wouldn't have come here." When Fu Mingdan heard this, he sighed. He didn't doubt Gao Chengtu's words. The 3 realm gates could only be used to leave, but not to return. In the past, communication between the 3 realms had mostly relied on the 2 realms dial, which had been passed down from the realm gates. If it weren't for that, they wouldn't have been able to trick people from the immortal kingdoms of the other two realms into coming here, and then wipe them out in one fell swoop. He thought for a moment, then said, "Fellow Taoist, do you think it's possible to use the realm gate to return to the mountain and sea realm?" Gao Qingtu thought about it seriously, then said, "That's hard to say." Fu Mingdan couldn't help but sigh. However, he had already decided that no matter how much effort it would take, he would find the place where the earthly treasures kingdom used to be. He bowed again, then said, "I have another presumptuous request." Gao Qingtu could roughly guess what he wanted to say. "Fellow Taoist, please speak." Fu Mingdan said sincerely, "Fellow Taoist, would you be willing to impart your Taoist techniques to us? If fellow Taoist agrees, my Do Liang sect will treat you as the sect's teacher." Gao Qingtu actually had the same idea, but things that were too easy to obtain wouldn't be valued too much. After all, the Do Liang sect was different from those who didn't cultivate in the mortal world. Even if they didn't have the Taoist techniques, they could still manage. Thus, he pretended to be hesitant, and only reluctantly agreed after Fu Mingdan asked him several times. After the banquet, Fu Mingdan seemed to be afraid that he would go back on his word, so he signed a contract with him on the spot. The next day, he sent over 100 people to cultivate with him. Gao Qingtu didn't say much, and without holding back, he imparted everything he knew. In fact, because these disciples belonged to the Do Liang sect, even if they cultivated Taoist techniques, they couldn't be considered as his disciples. However, he didn't care about such things. In fact, he hoped that some of them would have extraordinary latent talent for Taoist techniques. That way, he would have even more people to exchange Taoist techniques with. The techniques he imparted were quickly organized into a bundle of bamboo slips, which were then delivered to a white-robed cultivator. His name was Guan Cheng, and he was one of the two people with the highest cultivation base in the Do Liang sect. He had the ability to pierce through the void and travel to the outer heavens, which was why everyone in the sect referred to him as the Grand Dharma Lord. After reading through the bamboo slips, he looked down at the emissary and said, "This Taoist magic is very profound, and I can't see through it. The person who created it must have magical power far above mine." The emissary's heart tightened. "In that case," he said, "in the opinion of the Grand Dharma Lord, should we continue to search for the mountain and sea realm? The Do Liang sect had exterminated many powers in the past, and the three great immortal kingdoms were one of them. If someone was more powerful than them, would they attack them? Why not?" Guancheng said. "You don't need to worry too much," he said. "We've been attacking the sects from the outer heavens for the sake of seeking the Tao. If it weren't for the rumors that there are legacies left behind by ancient almighty beings, why would we need to attack them? On the other hand, if we can enter the inner world that fellow Taoist Gao spoke of, then even if we have to serve that person, as long as we can ensure the continuation of the sect and the continuation of the Tao, it will all be worth it." The emissary looked at the bamboo slips, hesitated for a moment, and then said, "But, Grand Dharma Lord, if all of the disciples of the later generation learn this Taoist magic, doesn't that mean that the Do Liang sect will no longer have a legacy?" Guancheng shook his head. "Taoist magic is nothing more than a ladder leading to the great Tao. If a superior Taoist magic was placed in front of you, and clearly stated that it could lead you to the great Tao, would you set it aside and not cultivate it?" The emissary was speechless. Guancheng flicked his sleeve and said solemnly, "There is no time for us to think about things that are too far in the future. If there is a Taoist magic to guide us, then we should follow it. Going against the flow and stubbornly sticking to the rules is a path to death." Gao Qingtu was here to teach the Taoist magic, but he didn't expect that he would actually stay here for 50 years. After 50 years, almost all of the later generation of the Do Liang sect had received his teachings, especially one called Shu Qing, whose aptitude was unprecedented. In just a few decades of cultivation, his cultivation had actually caught up to Gao Qingtu's, and he had asked Gao Qingtu several times to teach him the subsequent Taoist magic. Gao Qingtu told him, "I told you long ago that I have already told you everything I know. Next, it is up to you to comprehend it yourself." Shu Qing said, "But Teacher Gao, disciple still feels that something is missing?" Gao Qingtu said, I have thought about it. Perhaps this is because you have not personally seen the Dharma steel. Shu Qing had also heard about the Dharma steel that descended from the sky, and he couldn't help but ask, "What is different about this place?" Gao Chengtu said, "I've told you before that the first method I practiced was seen from a tablet. However, only those who are fated will be able to see it. As for what you've learned, it was through my mouth. Perhaps there's something else on the tablet that I've seen, but I can't say. That's why you feel that there's something missing." Shu Qing asked, "Could it be that this Dharma steel can only be found in the mountain and sea realm?" Gao Chengtu said, "According to what I know, there is more than one such Dharma steel. They are scattered throughout the heavens, but it is difficult for those who are not fated to find them." Shu Qing said with disappointment, "In that case, disciple is not fated to see it?" Gao Chengtu said with a smile, "That is..." Before he could finish speaking, the sky suddenly darkened. He couldn't help but look up and saw beams of spiritual light and heavenly fire tearing through the sky, falling straight down to the ground. He was shocked and stood up to look up. He felt that this scene was somewhat familiar, and he couldn't help but have a thought that even he didn't dare to believe. After Yuan Mei escaped by a fluke, he had originally planned to retract his aura and go back to sleep. However, Zhizhuang's Wei Li repeatedly swept through the worlds, and it seemed like he would not give up. Yuan Mei didn't dare to do that, and could only wander around the places where the magic power fluctuations were weak, and travel back and forth between the worlds. However, when he was moving towards one of the worlds, he accidentally bumped into a strange magic power. It was hard to say whether he bumped into it by accident, or if the magic power was waiting for him there. When his magic power touched it, they fused together and he learned countless principles. Without any reason, he learned the method to unravel the true paths, and he also learned a place where the good fortune fragment might exist. Not only was he not happy, but he was terrified. Although his temperament wasn't up to standard, it didn't mean that he was really muddle-headed. He understood that this thing wouldn't appear in front of him for no reason, and it was such a coincidence. This must have been deliberately sent by someone. He thought about the few parties fighting in the void, and the person who sent this magic power obviously wanted him to improve his cultivation to stir up more trouble. His expression instantly became uncertain. From the bottom of his heart, he naturally hoped that his cultivation could improve greatly. If he reached the second realm, he might be able to make Zhizhuang Daoren fear him like Zhang Yan. However, he also knew that the person who sent these things wanted him to do so. At this moment, he didn't want to fulfill the wish of the mastermind, but it was difficult for him to give up this opportunity to improve his strength. After hesitating for a while, he still made a decision. The current situation was dangerous, and he was facing the threat of Zhizhuang. His own strength was the foundation, so why wouldn't he accept this thing that was sent to him? No matter what the mastermind wanted to do, as long as he had enough strength to deal with it, what was there to be afraid of? With these thoughts, he decided to look for the good fortune fragment. If it really existed, he would swallow it first, and then think about other things. Thus, with a change of heart, he searched for the realm where the good fortune fragment might exist. Chapter 2168. The meteor shower lasted for an entire day. Regardless of whether it was north or south, the mortals on the continent could see it day or night. The people of the Duliang sect sensed that something was amiss, and immediately sent disciples to investigate. They found that most of the meteors had fallen into the sea. To cultivators, this was just a bit of a hassle. Over the course of a single night, they fished up numerous tiny stones. They were incredibly hard, and couldn't be damaged no matter what they did. It was impossible to say what had happened to cause them to be so badly damaged. The disciples of the Duliang sect tried to piece the rubble back together, but could only barely make out that it had originally been a stone stele, and its surface was engraved with cryptic characters that were difficult to understand. Everyone present could tell that these items were not simple, and immediately sent them to the sect. The higher-ups of the Duliang sect looked at them for a long time, but still couldn't understand what they meant. They could only tell that they contained some Taoist charm, which meant that they were no ordinary item. However, there were simply too many parts missing, which made it even more difficult to understand. However, a few days later, one of the disciples who had recently been learning a new Taoist magic came across the stone, and realized that it looked very similar to the mountain and sea realm erosion symbol that Gao Qingtu had taught them. Gao Qingtu had also mentioned that the magic he had learned all those years ago had come from a stone stele that had descended from the heavens. After hearing this, the elders of the Duliang sect debated for a long time, and in the end, they decided to ask Gao Qingtu to identify the item. Half a month later, Gao Qingtu arrived at the Duliang sect, where he found the remnant of the stone stele in a secret temple. When he saw the meteor shower, he had already guessed what it was. When he saw the familiar erosion symbol on the item, he was even more certain that it was a stone stele that recorded the Taoist magic he had learned. It looked exactly the same as the one he had seen before. However, he felt that it was missing something. The elder of the Duliang sect, seeing that he hadn't spoken for a long time, asked, "Fellow Taoist Gao, how is it?" Gao Qingtu nodded. "Correct. It's almost exactly the same as the stone stele I saw all those years ago. The Taoist magic I learned came from this stone stele." When the higher-ups of the Starlink sect heard this answer, they were greatly excited. This wasn't as simple as obtaining a Tao art. Most importantly, with this object, this Tao art could be considered to be the Starlink sect's own Tao art, and it wouldn't be an external Tao art any longer. They also made a prompt decision and immediately sent more people to salvage the rubble. However, no matter how hard they searched, they were only able to piece together half of the stone tablet. The other half was nowhere to be found. When Shu Qing and the other disciples found out about this, they were also extremely excited, and they hurriedly returned to the sect. Ever since he heard Gao Qingtu's explanation, he had always hoped to be able to personally observe the method transmission stone tablet. This time, it was fate bestowed upon him by the heavens, so how could he miss it? After he saw the stone tablet, he stood in front of it for an entire night. Many of the things that he did not understand before suddenly became clear. However, when he wanted to continue, he found that there was only half of the stone tablet, which made him feel very regretful. The Great Liang sect acted quickly. They had sent quite a number of youths to try their luck. Indeed, quite a number of them understood the meaning of the stone tablet on the spot. Within a few days, there were results. The content that these disciples relayed was very similar to the Tao techniques that Gao Qingtu had taught them, but the derivation and elaboration of the Tao techniques were far inferior to the latter. This made the elders of the sect extremely disappointed. They realized that other than having half of the broken stone tablet, which could be used as the foundation of the sect, they did not gain any additional gains in the Tao techniques. Thus, they temporarily gave up on the idea of abandoning Gao Qingtu. Gao Qingtu felt that he was no longer of much use and had the intention to leave. On this day, after he finished teaching the Tao techniques, a Taoist boy came forward and bowed respectfully. He said, "Master Gao, the great Dharma master requests to see you." Gao Qingtu knew that only the person with the highest realm of mana in Great Liang sect had earned this title just now. In the past 50 years, he had been to the Great Liang sect many times, but he had never seen these two people even once. He said, "May I know which great Dharma master has invited me?" The boy replied, "It's Dharma Master Guan." Gao Qingtu understood and felt slightly relieved. This Dharma master was rumored to have a good temper, and he did not follow any rules when doing things. He would often come out to preach Tao to the disciples under him, and sometimes he would even joke with the junior disciples. He never put on any airs, which was completely different from the other Dharma master too, who was known for his strictness. He followed the boy to the back of the mountain, and they walked up a high hill. They stopped in front of a hut. The boy said, "Dharma master is inside. Master Gao, please come inside." Gao Qingtu thanked him and lifted the curtain to enter. He saw a Taoist in white sitting inside. His appearance was average, but his skin and bones were like jade, and his eyes were as clear as stars. He went forward and bowed, saying, "Dharma Master Guan greets you." Guan Cheng raised his hand to return the greeting and said with a smile, "Fellow Taoist Gao, please take a seat. I don't have any rules here." Gao Qingtu thanked him and sat down. Guan Cheng looked at him and said with a smile, I see that fellow Taoist is intending to leave this place. Gao Chengtu was a little surprised, but he did not deny it. He said, the great Dharma master saw through it. Guancheng said, fellow Taoist has been teaching Tao here, but your Tao skills have not improved much. If I were you, I would not stay here for long. Gao Chengtu raised his hand and said, all these years, I am indebted to your sect for treating me well. Unfortunately, this is not a place for me to stay. Please forgive me, Dharma Master. Guancheng smiled and said, I have no intention of stopping you. If we are fated, we will meet. If not, we will part. Fellow Taoist can leave or stay as you wish. However, I have a favor to ask of you. Gao Chengtu said, I dare not. Please speak, Dharma Master. Guancheng said, I have seen the Dharma Inheritance Stone Tablet. Although the Tao skills on it are good, they seem to be incomplete. It is difficult to improve by relying on them. I wonder if the Tao skills that you have seen before can reach the upper state? Gao Chengtu thought for a moment, then replied cautiously, I don't know if I can reach the upper state. However, the Tao skills on the Dharma Inheritance Stone Tablet that your sect has obtained are incomplete. They are indeed lacking from what I have seen before. Guancheng nodded and said, fellow Taoist, I presume that you are going to return to the mountain and sea realm. Could you bring a few disciples of my sect with you? Gao Chengtu sighed and said, it's just that the mountain and sea realm is difficult to find, and I don't know if I can return. I fear that I will delay your sect's disciples. Guancheng smiled and said, of course not. I believe that this matter will not be difficult, and that the crux lies with you. Gao Chengtu's heart trembled and he said, why do you say that, great Dharma Master? Guancheng said, from what you've told me previously, you are quite fated with this Tao technique. Perhaps it's because of this that when you had the heart to spread the Tao technique, a stone tablet descended from the sky. He pointed at his chest. If you have the heart to go back and prove your Tao technique, there might be a way back. The key is to see what your heart is like. Gao Chengtu thought for a moment and said, great Dharma Master, are you saying that if I want to go back, then I might be able to find a way back to the mountain and sea realm? Guancheng smiled and said, that is indeed a possibility. He flicked his sleeve, and an image of a mountain and water appeared on the ground in front of the table. He pointed to a certain spot and said, there is a gate of 2 realms here. However, no one from the realm has ever tried to pass through it with a sundial. My sect's disciples have also tried, and the result has been the same. Fellow Taoist, since you have found a way back, perhaps you can test your luck. Just now, there was something he didn't say out loud. He guessed that this Tao skill had been created by some almighty being, and since Gao Chengtu was fated with it, it was possible that he had received the favor of that almighty being. In that case, it was highly likely that the almighty being would be able to do it. Gao Chengtu looked at the image of a mountain and water for a moment, then stood up and bowed. He said, I will be leaving your esteemed sect in 2 days. If any of your sect's disciples are willing to accompany me, they may accompany me on my journey. The next day, after Gao Chengtu returned to his lodgings from Du Liang sect, he made some preparations and set off for the gate of 2 realms. This time, other than Gao Gua, there were dozens of Du Liang sect's disciples who had succeeded in the new Tao traveling with him. The group took a flying shuttle and after 20 days, they arrived at the foot of the mountain where the gate of 2 realms was located. Gao Chengtu looked up and saw a majestic snow mountain standing between heaven and earth. There seemed to be a silver light flashing above it. This time, Shu Qing was also one of the people traveling with him. He came over and said, Master Gao, that light is where the gate of 2 realms is located. The wind and clouds above here are constantly changing, and there is also the chaotic magnetic force. The flying shuttle can't go up, I'm afraid we can only go on foot. Gao Chengtu nodded and got off the flying shuttle. He followed the path that was opened earlier and went up the mountain. After a day, he arrived at a spacious area at the peak of the mountain. He saw a silver whirlpool swirling there. Although he had crossed the gate of 2 realms a few times, deep down in his heart, he was still full of respect for this kind of supernatural creation. He said, Shu Qing, tell the people accompanying me to follow me closely. Otherwise, after crossing the gate of 2 realms, we will easily be separated. Shu Qing acknowledged and went back to pass down the order. Gao Qingtu waited until the people behind him were almost ready before he took a deep breath and stepped inside. Behind him, Gao Guo, Shu Qing, and the other disciples who were close to him also hurriedly followed. The moment he stepped in, he felt a shock. He saw countless sceneries moving away from him, and it was as if he was falling somewhere. This feeling was something he had never experienced before. After a moment, his figure stood still and a piece of sky appeared in front of him. He knew that he had arrived at the opposite side of the Gate of Two Realms. He tried to sense his surroundings and discovered that he was standing in a city that was covered in smoke and fire. The people in the city were all emaciated and covered in dirt. Wails could be heard everywhere, and the outside was surrounded by layers upon layers of soldiers. This was undoubtedly a city that was about to fall. However, he unexpectedly found that there was a lot of mana and spiritual light in the army outside, and there were uneven fluctuations of chi dynamic. It was obvious that there were many cultivators inside. He also noticed that there was a picture of a devil on the flag that these people were holding. He felt that he had seen it somewhere before. While he was thinking, he suddenly heard tens of thousands of soldiers outside the city shouting in unison, "Worship my way, live forever, Lubu, ancestor of heaven and earth." As they shouted, the dark clouds in the sky rolled, and bolts of thunder and fire fell on the city. Gao Qingtu originally did not want to intervene in these mortal matters, but as these people shouted, the chi dynamic also rose. He did not know why, but when he felt this chi, he felt an inexplicable sense of disgust towards these people. Immediately, his mana circulated, and a strong wind gathered, blocking all the thunder and fire that came attacking. Then, the chi dynamic rushed, and with a loud bang, the filth was broken, and the light of the sky split the clouds for a moment. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.